During our vacation, my wife suddenly collapsed at a coffee shop. I rushed her to the emergency room, but when the doctor treating her walked over and asked if I was the patient family member, I froze. The man standing in front of me was my dead son from 9 years ago. I am Waylon, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful commercial construction owner who built an empire from the ground up as a black man in Chicago, I thought I had seen every kind of betrayal. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and mistook your silence for weakness. The heavy ceramic coffee cup hit the saucer with a sharp, aggressive crack that echoed over the low hum of the crowded cafe. Sylvia slid a thick stack of legal documents across the sticky table, pushing them right up against my plate. Her perfectly manicured fingernails tapped impatiently on the signature line. "Sign the deed, Waylon," she ordered. Her voice carried that sharp, authoritative edge she reserved strictly for me when we were in public. "Heather needs the lake house right now. She is a grieving widow trying to survive on her own. You are a 70-year-old man with a failing memory and a stubborn streak. You do not need a massive 6-bedroom vacation property sitting empty for 11 months out of the year. Sign the paper right now so we can move forward." I looked down at the documents, and then I looked at the woman I had married 15 years ago. Sylvia wore a silk blouse that cost more than the first work truck I ever purchased. I paid for that blouse. I paid for the heavy diamond rings glittering on her fingers. I paid for the luxury SUV idling in the parking lot outside. As a man who spent 4 decades fighting tooth and nail to establish a successful company in a brutal industry, I provided absolutely everything for this family. She respected absolutely nothing. "Heather is 32 years old," I replied, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. "My son Brandon died 9 years ago. Your white daughter-in-law has grieved enough to date 3 different men and purchase 2 luxury sports cars using my corporate credit line. The lake house stays in my name. I will not hand over my hard-earned assets to a woman who uses my son's memory as a blank check to fund her extravagant lifestyle." Sylvia's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. She leaned across the small table, knocking over the sugar dispenser in her sudden fury. "You selfish, arrogant old fool," she hissed loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. "Your son is dead because he was reckless and stupid. Heather is family. I am your family. You will transfer the deed today, or I will initiate the conservatorship process we discussed with the lawyers last week. Your mind is slipping, Waylon. You forget things constantly. The courts will easily agree with me when I tell them you are no longer fit to manage your own finances." She reached into her expensive designer handbag to pull out an entirely different folder. The threat was explicitly clear and brutally calculated. My own wife intended to declare me mentally incompetent to legally steal the entirety of my estate. But before her fingers could open the heavy manila folder, her hand stopped violently midair. Sylvia gasped loudly. The sound was wet, shallow, and terrifying. Her eyes went completely wide, staring at a blank spot just above my left shoulder. Her lips parted to hurl another venomous insult, but no words came out. Instead, a thick ribbon of white foam spilled from the corner of her mouth, dripping down her chin. She convulsed once violently and collapsed sideways. Her head slammed against the hard edge of the wooden table before her body hit the linoleum floor with a heavy thud. The legal documents scattered everywhere. The cafe instantly erupted into panicked screams as customers backed away from our table. I did not panic. I spent 40 years managing active construction sites and dealing with catastrophic workplace accidents. I knew exactly how to handle a sudden medical emergency. I dropped to my knees, checked her pulse, and yelled for the paralyzed barista to call an ambulance immediately. Her pulse was erratic, racing incredibly fast like a broken engine pushing itself to the absolute limit. Her skin was quickly turning an unnatural, terrifying shade of pale gray. Her breathing became jagged and uneven. 10 minutes later, the heavy ambulance doors slammed shut. I sat in the back of the moving vehicle, watching the paramedics desperately pump oxygen into my wife's failing lungs as the siren wailed above us. My mind raced with brutal, razor-sharp clarity. Sylvia was perfectly healthy. She ran 3 miles every single morning and had a spotless medical record. A sudden violent seizure accompanied by severe foaming at the mouth was not a random stroke or a standard heart attack. It was a chemical reaction. Someone had poisoned her. The ambulance screeched to a halt outside the emergency room bay. The sliding doors burst open, letting in a rush of cold air. Nurses pulled the stretcher out, shouting complicated medical jargon into the chaotic, brightly lit hallway. I followed them closely, pushing through the swinging double doors into the sterile, blinding light of the trauma ward. The smell of strong antiseptic and sharp bleach filled my nose. A tall doctor in dark blue scrubs sprinted out of trauma room 3. He pulled a stethoscope around his neck and barked sharp orders at the nurses who were desperately securing Sylvia to the hospital bed. "Push 2 milligrams of Ativan and get a full toxicology screen immediately," the doctor ordered, pointing at the monitors. His voice was deep, authoritative, and terrifyingly familiar to me. The doctor turned around, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. He looked directly at me. He froze completely. The plastic medical clipboard in his hand slipped from his grip, clattering loudly against the tiled hospital floor. The papers scattered across the ground, just like Sylvia's documents at the cafe. "Are you the patient's family member?" the head nurse asked me, completely oblivious to the sudden suffocating silence stretching between the doctor and me. I could not breathe. I could not speak a single word. I stared intensely at the doctor's face. He had a small crescent-shaped scar just above his left eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident. He had the exact same strong, square jawline as my father. He had the exact same dark, piercing eyes that I looked at in the mirror every single morning. The man standing in front of me, wearing a white coat and blue scrubs, was Brandon, my only son. My son died 9 years ago in a horrific boating fire on Lake Michigan. I buried an empty, charred casket because the authorities told me there was nothing left to recover. I spent 3 years drowning in brutal, agonizing grief, attending therapy and visiting a grave that I now realized was empty. I personally paid Heather $2 million from his life insurance policy to ensure she survived the terrible tragedy without facing financial ruin. Brandon was staring at me. His chest was heaving as he breathed heavily. He did not look like a ghost or a trick of my aging mind. He looked like a living, breathing man whose deepest, most terrifying secret had just walked through the emergency room doors and shattered his carefully constructed reality. "Dad," Brandon whispered. The single word barely escaped his trembling lips, but it echoed in my ears like a gunshot. Before I could take a single step forward to touch him, Brandon lunged across the busy hallway. He grabbed my forearm with a grip, like solid iron cutting off my circulation. He pulled me forcefully away from the trauma room, ignoring the confused shouts of the nurses. He dragged me down a narrow, empty corridor and shoved me into a dark, sterile supply closet. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind us, sealing us in the dark, away from the chaos of the emergency room. "Listen to me very carefully," he whispered, his voice urgent and full of raw panic as he pressed his back against the closed door. "You cannot tell anyone I am here, and you absolutely cannot trust your wife. Your life is in immediate danger." "You are dead," I said. My voice was a raw, broken rasp tearing through my throat. "I buried you 9 years ago." I stood in the freezing Chicago rain and watched an empty casket go into the cold ground. "I mourned you every single day while trying to hold this fractured family together." Aaron pressed his heavy hands firmly against my shoulders. His dark eyes darted frantically toward the heavy wooden door, checking for any shadows passing beneath the crack. "I am so sorry, Dad," he said. His voice dropped to a harsh, desperate whisper. "But I did not die in that fiery crash on Lakeshore Drive. I staged the entire explosion. I had to disappear completely because my wife and your wife tried to brutally murder me." The sterile supply closet felt like it was shrinking rapidly, crushing the breath out of me. The air turned entirely to ice in my lungs. My wife and my daughter-in-law conspired to murder my only child. "Valerie and Madison intentionally severed my brake lines." Aaron continued rapidly, his words spilling out like a suppressed flood. "They rigged the engine block to ignite on high impact. They wanted to collect the $5 million trust fund you established for me. I managed to jump from the moving vehicle seconds before it hit the concrete barricade and burst into flames. I knew if I survived and went to the police, they would just hire better lawyers or try again. They would absolutely target you next. I had to vanish completely to figure out how to dismantle them. I changed my name. I went to medical school out of state. I have been watching them build their financial traps around you for 9 years." I pushed his hands away violently. My initial shock was rapidly replaced by a hot, burning rage that consumed my entire body. "I am actively funding my own murderers," I stated. The realization was absolute and sickening. I personally paid Madison $2 million from your life insurance policy. I let her live a life of absolute luxury while you hid in the shadows. I watched her parade around my home wearing diamonds purchased with the blood money from your supposed death. She played the grieving widow to perfection, squeezing every ounce of sympathy and cash out of my broken heart. "Yes," Aaron confirmed, his expression hardening into pure forged steel. "She is a parasite, and Valerie collapsing today was not a random medical anomaly or a sudden stroke." Aaron reached into the deep pocket of his dark blue scrubs. He pulled out a small, clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was a crumpled, heavily stained napkin. I smelled her breath the exact second the paramedics brought her through the trauma bay doors, Aaron said. His eyes were completely dark, devoid of any standard medical detachment. It is aconite, wolfsbane. It is an incredibly toxic, untraceable, slow-acting cardiac poison. Dad, she did not ingest this highly lethal substance intentionally. I stared at the plastic bag in his steady hand. The brutal truth slammed into my chest with the devastating force of a wrecking ball, demolishing a concrete wall. My wife, the woman I shared a bed with for 15 years, was actively trying to execute me. She was actively preparing it, I said, the fragmented pieces snapping together instantly in my mind. She collapsed right after drinking her own coffee at the cafe. She must have accidentally cross-contaminated her own cup while handling the toxic substance. She brought the poison to the meeting, intending to slip it into my drink while I was distracted by the argument over the property deed. She was preparing it specifically for you, Aaron said, his voice sharp and remarkably urgent. Think about it, Dad. She brings you to a highly public place. She aggressively pushes you to sign a property transfer deed to ensure Madison gets the lake house. She threatens you with a fraudulent medical conservatorship to steal the rest of the commercial construction empire. They have the forged legal papers fully prepared. They have your life insurance policies perfectly positioned. They are making their final move right now. If she had succeeded today, you would be the one seizing on the emergency room table, and she would be a wealthy, grieving widow playing the victim for the cameras. I looked at my son. The young boy I lost had returned as a man of absolute mechanical precision. I did not feel fear anymore. I felt the cold, calculating clarity of a builder preparing to demolish a rotten, unstable structure. I had spent my entire life building massive foundations and unbreakable fortresses. I knew exactly how to tear them down efficiently. I would strip them of everything they valued until they had nothing left but their own greed. What is the first step? I asked. My voice was no longer a broken rasp. It was a firm command from a man ready for war. Aaron opened the closet door, slightly peering out into the chaotic emergency room hallway. Go back out there. Look entirely terrified. You need to play the oblivious, grieving husband perfectly. You need to let them think they are winning this game. If you go home and confront them right now, they will panic and destroy all the physical evidence. I will closely monitor Valerie here in the intensive care unit, Aaron continued. She is stabilized, but I will keep her heavily sedated and unconscious. The toxicology screen will confirm the aconite poisoning. I secured the blood samples myself so they cannot hide or tamper with the medical evidence. You need to go back to the estate and secure the poison vial. Find the forged legal documents. We are going to lock them permanently in a legal cage they built entirely themselves. I stepped out of the supply closet. The bright fluorescent lights of the busy hospital hallway hit my eyes, but my vision had never been clearer. I walked back toward the trauma room waiting area. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket and found Madison contact information. I was about to invite the devil directly into my home. I hit dial. The phone rang twice before Madison answered. Loud, upbeat pop music blasted in the background of her call. Waylon, what do you want? Madison answered impatiently. She did not call me Dad. She discarded the polite familial titles the exact moment my monthly bank transfers were delayed. I am at a luxury spa appointment right now. Valerie told me she was handling your pathetic little real estate tantrum this morning. Valerie is in the hospital, I said, keeping my voice panicked and artificially weak. I forced my breathing to sound shallow and erratic. She suddenly collapsed at the cafe. The doctors believe she suffered a massive, severe stroke. She is entirely unresponsive. The pop music in the background stopped instantly. A sharp, calculated silence filled the phone line. A stroke, Madison asked. Her voice did not hold a single ounce of genuine sorrow or concern. It held intense, urgent calculation. Is she conscious? Can she speak to anyone at all? No, I replied. She is in a medically induced coma. I am driving home right now to gather her medical records. The hospital needs her insurance information for emergency surgery immediately. Do not touch anything in her home office, Madison commanded sharply. The sudden panic in her voice was not for Valerie Health. It was for her hidden secrets. I am driving to your house right now. I will handle the necessary paperwork. You are too emotional, Waylon, to manage this crisis. I need full unrestricted access to your personal bank accounts immediately to cover these unexpected medical expenses and hospital fees. You just sit quietly in the living room and wait for me to arrive. I am taking control of this situation. I lowered the phone and disconnected the call. The trap was perfectly set. Madison was rushing directly into the snare, blinded by her desperate greed and arrogant assumptions. I took a deep breath, letting the sterile hospital air fill my lungs. The silent adjustment had officially begun. I walked out of the emergency room doors and headed toward my truck, leaving the ghost of my past behind to secure the future of my empire. I drove my truck back to the massive, quiet estate I had purchased 10 years ago. in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Chicago. The sprawling property was perfectly manicured and completely silent. Walking through the grand entryway, I felt no comfort. The house was spotless, cold, and entirely devoid of love. I did not waste time mourning the illusion of my marriage. I channeled the heavy grief of the past 9 years into pure cold calculation. I bypassed the grand staircase and walked straight down the hall to Valerie's private home office. She always kept this room strictly locked, claiming she needed absolute privacy for her charity work. Today, that lock did not matter to me. I walked out to my truck and retrieved a heavy, solid steel crowbar. I returned to the hallway, lifted the heavy iron bar, and shattered the thick wooden door frame with one swift, violent swing. The wood splintered, loudly echoing through the empty mansion. I stepped inside the meticulously organized room. I completely ignored the expensive mahogany desktop and the standard filing cabinets. Aaron had warned me that Valerie and Madison were meticulous criminals who operated in the shadows. I scanned the floor carefully, using my decades of commercial construction experience to spot structural anomalies. I noticed a subtle unevenness beneath a thick, ornate Persian rug. I kicked the heavy rug aside. Beneath the polished oak floorboards, I spotted a hairline seam. I wedged the flat edge of the crowbar into the tight gap and forcefully pried the wooden planks upward. The wood cracked and gave way, revealing a hidden compartment excavated straight into the subfloor. Resting inside the dark cavity was a heavy steel biometric safe. Valerie thought her secrets were buried deep enough to survive any surface inspection. She underestimated a man who spent his entire life building massive foundations from the dirt up. I positioned the sharp steel wedge of the crowbar directly against the vulnerable electronic locking mechanism. I raised my heavy work boot and brought my heel down on the iron bar with bone-crushing force. The cheap electronic lock sparked and snapped under the immense pressure. I ripped the heavy steel door open. Inside the dark metal box, I uncovered the absolute depth of my wife, terrifying betrayal. I reached in and pulled out a thick stack of pristine legal folders. I opened the first file and found 3 separate maximum payout life insurance policies printed with my personal information. I scanned the beneficiary designation lines. My heart turned to a block of solid ice. The primary beneficiary on all 3 massive policies had been recently changed. Valerie had removed her own name. Madison was explicitly listed as the sole recipient of the funds through a private anonymous holding company. I looked at the bottom of the pages. The signatures authorizing these catastrophic financial changes were flawless, masterful forgeries of my exact handwriting. The betrayal was documented permanently in black ink. They had positioned Madison to inherit my entire commercial construction empire the second my heart stopped beating. I dropped the folders and reached deeper into the back of the hidden safe. My fingers brushed against a small, unlabeled, dark glass vial. I pulled it into the light. Beside the glass vial sat a highly precise digital scale and a sealed package of black latex surgical gloves. This was the aconite. This was the exact slow-acting, untraceable cardiac poison that Valerie had accidentally ingested at the cafe. This was the murder weapon they carefully sourced and intended to use on me while I slept in my own bed. I did not touch the glass vial with my bare hands. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket. My hands were incredibly steady. I turned on the camera and took high-resolution macro photographs of every single document. I photographed the forged signatures, the life insurance policies, the dark glass vial, the digital scale, and the latex gloves. I captured every angle of the physical evidence, proving their coordinated conspiracy to commit murder. I immediately opened my secure email application and uploaded the entire cache of digital evidence directly to an encrypted remote server. The proof of their malicious crimes was now backed up permanently out of their reach forever. I barely had enough time to push the broken safe back under the floorboards and pull the heavy Persian rug over the damaged wood before the front door of the estate swung open with a violent crash. The sharp, aggressive clicking of expensive high heels echoed rapidly across the hardwood floor. Madison marched straight into the house without knocking. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and carried a massive luxury leather tote bag over her shoulder. She did not offer a single word of comfort or ask how her mother-in-law was doing. She marched directly toward me, stopping right in the center of the living room. Her face was a mask of pure entitlement and arrogant authority. "Waylon, you need to sign this power of attorney document right this second," Madison demanded aggressively. She pulled a thick legal contract from her tote bag and shoved it toward my chest. "The hospital requires a massive deposit to keep Valerie in the intensive care unit. I need full unrestricted access to your business and personal bank accounts to cover Valerie mounting medical expenses." I stared at her, grasping the absolute audacity of her demands. "I will not sign over my accounts," I replied softly. Madison sneered at me, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "You will sign this paper today, Waylon, or I will initiate legal proceedings to have you formally evicted from this property by the end of the month," she threatened coldly. "You are completely incompetent." I forced my broad shoulders to slump forward, adopting the posture of a weak, tired, and broken old man. I rubbed my eyes slowly, pretending to be entirely overwhelmed by grief and profound confusion. "Madison, I cannot read these complicated legal documents right now," I pleaded, allowing my voice to tremble pathetically. "My mind is completely exhausted from the trauma at the hospital. Just give me 48 hours to process this terrible tragedy. I promise I will read the files and transfer whatever funds you need by Monday morning." Madison stared down at me with absolute contempt. She snatched the legal documents back and shoved them into her designer bag. "Fine," she snapped, her voice dripping with venomous cruelty. "You have until Monday morning to transfer the funds, Waylon. But hear me clearly. If that money is not in my holding account by 8 in the morning, I will personally instruct the hospital administration to pull the plug on Valerie life support machines. And after she dies, I will make sure the state locks you away in a miserable psychiatric ward for the rest of your miserable life." The sharp, aggressive clicking of expensive high heels echoed rapidly across the hardwood floor as Madison turned her back and marched away. The heavy mahogany front door slammed shut behind her, rattling the antique mirror hanging in the hallway. I stood entirely alone in the center of the massive living room, listening to the loud, arrogant roar of her luxury sports car engine fading down the long, private driveway. The exact moment the sound vanished, my trembling hands completely steadied. The slumped, exhausted posture I had carefully maintained for her benefit completely disappeared. I pulled my broad shoulders back, standing at my full height. I was no longer a confused, grieving husband crippled by sudden tragedy. I was the architect of my own survival, and I was preparing to dismantle her entire life. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket and dialed a highly secure, unlisted number. The phone rang exactly once before Jonathan answered. Jonathan was not a traditional family lawyer who dealt in gentle mediations or quiet settlements. He was a vicious, highly effective corporate litigator who specialized in utterly destroying hostile takeovers and dismantling fraudulent business partners. I was the most feared attorney in the Chicago commercial construction sector, and he answered directly to me. "Waylon," he answered in a crisp, professional tone. "I did not expect to hear from you today. Jonathan, I need you to bypass all standard channels and initiate Protocol 0. Immediately, I instructed, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I need a comprehensive covert forensic audit of my wife Sylvia and my daughter-in-law Madison. I need to know absolutely everything about their private financial movements over the past 5 years." "Protocol 0 is an incredibly aggressive maneuver," Waylon, Jonathan noted, his voice shifting instantly into absolute business mode. "It will trigger deep background checks across international banking networks. If they are hiding assets, I will find them, but it requires bypassing your own joint security layers." "Do it," I commanded. "They attempted to murder me this morning to seize the commercial construction empire. They have forged life insurance policies and a fully prepared fraudulent medical conservatorship hiding in a floor safe. I need to know exactly how much of my capital they have stolen and where they hid it before Monday morning. I need them fully exposed without alerting them to the ongoing investigation." "You will have a preliminary report by this evening," Jonathan promised. I ended the call, feeling the heavy gears of my empire begin to turn in the shadows. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from an unknown hospital extension. I answered quickly, knowing it was Aaron. "Dad," he spoke in a low, urgent whisper, clearly stepping into an empty stairwell to secure his privacy. "I just finished reviewing Sylvia and her medical chart along with the official admission paperwork. The toxicology screen formally confirmed the heavy presence of aconite in her bloodstream. I have personally locked the lab results in a secure digital vault that cannot be altered or deleted by anyone in the administration." "Is she conscious?" I asked, walking toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of cold water. "No, she is medically stabilized, but I am keeping her under heavy chemical sedation," Aaron explained. "Her heart rate is returning to normal, but she will remain completely unconscious until we intentionally decide to wake her up." "But Dad, I found something incredibly disturbing in her formal hospital admission profile. When the intake nurses ran her identification through the central database, they pulled up a heavily modified emergency directive she filed legally 3 months ago. She completely removed you from her contact list. My own wife completely erased my legal existence in her medical files." "Yes," Aaron confirmed, his voice hardening. "She formally revoked your status as her next of kin. She listed Madison as her sole medical proxy and her absolute designated decision-maker. If she had successfully poisoned you today and you ended up in a hospital bed, they would have used these exact same legal maneuvers to completely block me or any of your loyal business partners from interfering. They intended to bypass you entirely, isolate you in a private medical facility, and pull the plug the moment the life insurance policies cleared their bank accounts. The sheer depth of their calculated malice was staggering. They had spent months preparing the legal battlefield, ensuring I would die alone without a single advocate to question my sudden decline. They built a flawless execution plan, but they made one fatal miscalculation. They accidentally brought my dead son back to life. "Keep her sedated, Aaron," I ordered. Madison gave me a strict ultimatum. She expects my funds cleared by Monday morning. We need to drag this out perfectly. Later that afternoon, the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the empty living room. My phone buzzed loudly, breaking the heavy silence. It was Jonathan calling back much sooner than I anticipated. "Waylon, the preliminary audit is complete," Jonathan announced, his voice laced with genuine disbelief. "I have spent my entire career tracking corporate embezzlement, but the financial damage your wife and daughter-in-law have inflicted upon themselves is absolutely catastrophic. They are completely bankrupt." I tightened my grip on the phone. "Explain the exact details to me, Jonathan." 5 years ago, you transferred $2 million into a private trust for Madison following your son passing," Jonathan began referencing his digital files. "Madison and Sylvia immediately funneled that entire capital into a series of highly aggressive offshore gambling accounts and extremely risky luxury real estate startups. They attempted to launch a high-end lifestyle brand targeting the elite white socialites of Chicago. The business completely failed within 18 months. They hemorrhaged money covering massive operational debts and funding their own extravagant public image." "So they are completely broke?" I asked, feeling a sharp surge of vindication. "Worse than broke," Waylon, Jonathan corrected sharply. "They are deeply underwater. They have secretly leveraged heavily against the value of your commercial construction company using fraudulent signatures to secure short-term predatory loans. Those private lenders are demanding immediate repayment. Madison and Sylvia are exactly 3 days away from total financial ruin. If they do not secure a massive influx of cash, by Monday afternoon their creditors will seize their personal assets and potentially pursue severe criminal charges for the massive loan fraud. That explains their sudden desperate timeline," I realized aloud. "That explains why Sylvia tried to poison me at the cafe today instead of waiting for a more subtle opportunity. They are completely out of time and out of options. They are operating purely on blind panic." "Yes," Jonathan agreed. "I will prepare the asset freeze protocols to lock down your remaining accounts." Before I could thank Jonathan, I heard the heavy crunch of gravel outside my front window. A battered white commercial van parked aggressively in my driveway right behind my truck. Madison stepped out of the passenger side, clutching her oversized designer bag. A tall, imposing man in a dirty canvas work jacket stepped out of the driver's seat. I ended the call with Jonathan and walked to the front door, opening it just as they reached the porch. "I brought a structural contractor to fix the persistent leak in the roof," Madison announced smoothly, displaying a totally fake smile. "He needs to inspect the property immediately to assess the internal water damage." I looked directly at the contractor standing beside her. He was not a roofing specialist. I recognized his face instantly. I had fired him from a commercial build site 7 years ago. He was a highly skilled underground document forger notorious in the Chicago construction scene for fabricating fake permits and counterfeit property deeds. I masked my sudden realization behind a blank, exhausted expression. I stepped back and opened the heavy oak door wider, gesturing for them to enter my home. Heather marched inside without wiping her designer boots on the mat. The forger followed her, keeping his head slightly lowered. He wore a dirty canvas jacket and a baseball cap pulled down tight over his eyes. He clearly did not recognize me as the massive commercial construction owner who had blacklisted him from every major build site in Chicago 7 years ago. To him, I was just another frail, clueless old mark waiting to be scammed. I offered them a polite, weak nod and muttered that I was going to the kitchen to make some tea to calm my nerves. Heather waved me away with a dismissive flick of her wrist, telling me to stay out of their way while they inspected the structural damage in the living room. The second I stepped behind the thick granite kitchen island, my entire demeanor shifted. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I quickly activated a highly sensitive audio recording application I used to document hostile union negotiations. I slid the phone under a decorative fruit bowl near the open kitchen archway, pointing the microphone directly toward the expansive living room. I stood perfectly still, leaning against the cool marble countertop, and listened to the rats plotting in my house. The forger dropped his heavy tool bag onto my expensive hardwood floor with a loud thud. He did not talk about roofing materials or water damage. Holm immediately began listing his professional requirements for fabricating a legally binding document. "I need the original master deed to replicate the official state watermarks," he told Heather, his voice a low, gritty murmur. "The new will is going to be incredibly complex. You are asking me to completely overwrite a multi-million-dollar commercial construction estate and legally bypass the standard probate courts entirely. I can perfectly forge his handwriting, but the notary seals have to be absolutely flawless to survive a corporate audit." Heather laughed, a sharp, arrogant sound that echoed through the quiet house. "Just do your job correctly, and the courts will not suspect a single thing," she replied confidently. "The old fool is completely breaking down from grief. No one will question his sudden decision to secure his family legacy before he completely loses his mind." The forger unzipped his canvas bag and pulled out a thick stack of blank legal parchment. "I am taking a massive risk stepping foot inside this estate," he muttered aggressively. "The state penitentiary does not hand out light sentences for this level of corporate fraud. I need a $50,000 cash advance right now to cover my specialized equipment and secure my corrupt notary. I am not putting my neck on the line for a promise." Heather scoffed loudly, her high heels clicking sharply as she paced across the living room rug. "I do not have $50,000 in cash lying around right now," she snapped back angrily. "I told you on the phone that our liquid assets are temporarily tied up in offshore business investments. You will get your money on Monday morning, the exact second the banks open." The forger laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "I do not work on credit," he growled. "You call me when you have the cash." He reached down to grab his tool bag. "Wait!" Heather commanded, panic suddenly bleeding into her arrogant voice. "Do not walk out that door. I swear to you the funds will be absolutely guaranteed by Monday. I am forcing him to sign a total financial power of attorney tomorrow morning at the hospital. The absolute second that document is processed. I am liquidating every single one of his personal checking accounts and corporate retirement funds. He will not have a single dime left to his name. You will get your $50,000 plus a 20% bonus for the rush job." The forger paused, considering her desperate offer. Monday morning, he agreed coldly. "Have the cash ready, or I burn the forged documents and disappear." I stood frozen in the kitchen, processing the sheer magnitude of her malicious plan. Heather was not just trying to secure a future inheritance. She intended to completely drain my accounts and leave me entirely destitute by Monday. Her timeline was accelerating, aggressively driven by her massive hidden debts and pure, unadulterated greed. They were rushing headfirst toward the edge of a cliff. I quietly retrieved my phone from under the fruit bowl, stopping the recording and saving the audio file to my encrypted server. I walked back into the living room holding a cup of hot tea, playing the pathetic, broken old man one last time. I told Heather I needed to return to the hospital to deliver Sylvia her personal identification documents. I drove my truck directly to the medical center, bypassing the chaotic emergency room entrance and heading straight for the desolate concrete stairwell behind the intensive care unit. Brandon was already waiting for me on the fourth-floor landing. He wore his crisp white doctor coat, his stethoscope draped around his neck. The heavy metal door clicked shut, sealing us in the cold, echoing stairwell. I pulled my phone from my pocket and played the audio recording of Heather and the forger negotiating the fake will. Brandon listened with a dark, furious expression. His jaw clenched tight as he processed the absolute depravity of his supposed widow. "They are completely bankrupt," I told my son, keeping my voice rock solid. "Jonathan ran the financial audit this afternoon. They blew your entire life insurance payout on terrible investments and offshore gambling. They are millions of dollars in debt. They are trying to liquidate my entire construction empire by Monday morning to save themselves from total ruin." Brandon reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope stamped with the official hospital seal. He handed it to me. "And we now have the final nail for their coffins," he stated coldly. "This is the official toxicology report. The laboratory unequivocally confirmed the presence of aconite in her bloodstream. I personally secured the chain of custody. Sylvia cannot claim she ingested a bad cup of coffee or suffered a random allergic reaction. The poison is incredibly specific and highly lethal. We have the murder weapon resting in her hidden floor safe. We have the exact financial motive documented by Jonathan. We have the accelerated timeline captured on your audio recording. The legal trap is completely airtight." I took the heavy envelope, feeling the undeniable weight of absolute justice resting in my hands. I looked at the son I had mourned for 9 long, agonizing years. We were finally ready to strike back and destroy the parasites who had infected our family. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing alarm echoed from the pager clipped to Brandon belt. He glanced down at the small digital screen, and his dark eyes widened in sudden alarm. "Sylvia just woke up from her medically induced coma," Brandon announced, his voice sharp and urgent. "The floor nurses just sent an emergency page. She is fully conscious, and she completely refused to let you into the recovery room. She immediately demanded the staff call Heather. The final ambush is officially set." I walked down the brightly lit hospital corridor toward the intensive care recovery wing. The heavy scent of bleach and sterile linens did little to mask the underlying rot of the situation. Aaron had intentionally lowered Valerie's sedation levels early this morning, allowing her to regain consciousness. I paused outside her door, taking a deep breath to anchor my emotions. I needed to play the role of the devoted, terrified husband flawlessly. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. Valerie was propped up against a stack of white pillows. The harsh fluorescent lights washed out her complexion, but her dark eyes immediately locked onto me with predatory focus. The moment I approached the bed, her entire demeanor shifted with terrifying precision. She let out a weak, trembling sob and reached her hand out toward me. "Morgan." I was so incredibly scared, she whispered, her voice cracking perfectly. "I thought I was going to die in that cafe. I thought I would never see you again." I took her hand, forcing myself not to recoil from her cold touch. "I am right here, Valerie," I replied gently. "The doctor said you had a severe reaction, but you are going to be fine." She squeezed my fingers and let another manufactured tear roll down her cheek. "But we are not fine, Morgan," she sobbed, leaning closer. "The hospital administration came in here an hour ago. They told me my emergency care and the intensive care unit fees are astronomical. They threatened to place a medical lien on our primary estate if we do not provide immediate liquid capital. Madison told me, you refused to sign the financial power of attorney yesterday. You have to sign it right now, Morgan. If you do not give Madison access to the corporate accounts to pay these bills, the hospital will seize everything we own." I looked at the fragile, weeping woman in the hospital bed. The sheer audacity of her lie was staggering. Hospitals do not place immediate liens on properties within 24 hours of an emergency admission. She was weaponizing my supposed ignorance of medical billing against me. She reached under her thin hospital blanket and produced the exact same legal document Madison had aggressively shoved into my chest yesterday. "Please, Morgan," she begged, pressing the silver pen firmly into my palm. "Protect our family today before we lose absolutely everything we built." I held the silver pen in my hand, staring down at the fraudulent power of attorney. My mind raced, analyzing the angle of her trap. Before I entered the room, Aaron had intercepted me in the stairwell with a crucial piece of surveillance. He warned me that Madison had bypassed the visitor desk and spent exactly 10 minutes completely alone in Valerie hospital room, while the nurses were attending to a code blue down the hall. Aaron warned me to be hyper-vigilant about any items left near the bedside table. I looked up from the document and met Valerie's expectant gaze. "I need to read the fine print, Valerie," I said softly, adjusting my reading glasses. "I will not let them take our home, but I must ensure the bank routing numbers are correct." Valerie's jaw tightened infinitesimally. The loving wife facade cracked for a fraction of a second, revealing the desperate, venomous predator hiding underneath. She let out a long, exasperated sigh and let her head fall back against the pillows. "My throat is incredibly dry, Morgan," she complained, her tone shifting from pleading to demanding. "All this stress is making my heart race. Pour me a glass of water from that specific pitcher on the tray. I need to take my blood pressure medication before you start playing lawyer." I looked at the standard hospital tray resting over her bed. There were 2 pitchers. One was a sealed plastic bottle of mineral water provided by the cafeteria. The other was an open top-heavy glass pitcher, sitting dangerously close to the edge of the tray. I reached for the sealed bottle. "Not that one," Valerie snapped instantly, her voice sharp and panicky. "That water is completely warm. I want the ice water from the glass pitcher. Madison brought it fresh from the cafeteria ice machine before you arrived." I moved my hand toward the glass pitcher. I leaned in close, positioning my body between Valerie and the tray. My 40 years in commercial construction taught me to identify microscopic structural flaws on massive steel beams. My eyes caught a slight unnatural texture. Lined perfectly along the inner rim of the glass spout was a thin, chalky layer of white powder. Madison had intentionally laced the spout with a highly concentrated lethal dose of heavy sedatives. She assumed I was oblivious to the trap she prepared for me. They intended to drug me right here in the intensive care unit. Once I was unconscious, they would wrap my hand around the pen and forge my signature on the power of attorney. I stared at the faint white powder clinging to the heavy glass rim. Madison had specifically brought this heavy glass pitcher from the premium cafeteria downstairs to replace the standard plastic ones, ensuring the powder adhered perfectly to the rim. I wrapped my large calloused hand around the thick glass handle. I lifted the heavy pitcher into the air, bringing it hovering just over the edge of the metal tray. "Morgan, hurry up," Valerie hissed, tapping her fingers impatiently against the mattress. I lifted the pitcher slightly higher. I looked her dead in the eyes and allowed my grip to intentionally loosen. The heavy glass pitcher slipped straight through my fingers. It hit the solid linoleum floor with a massive, violent crash. The thick glass shattered into 100 jagged pieces, sending ice cubes and water exploding across the room. The water splashed directly onto Valerie's expensive leather handbag resting on the floor. The loving, terrified wife vanished instantly, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. "You absolute clumsy idiot," she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing brutally through the hospital ward. "Look at what you did. You ruined my designer bag. You cannot do a single simple task correctly. You are completely useless. You belong in a nursing home." She leaned over the bed, her face red with fury, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. Her sudden aggressive outburst was so loud and venomous that it completely shattered her fragile sick patient routine. I stood perfectly still, absorbing the verbal abuse with a blank expression. "I am so sorry, Valerie," I muttered, keeping my voice low and apologetic. My arthritis flared up suddenly. I immediately dropped to my knees, pretending to grovel and scramble for the mess. The hospital door swung open rapidly. A young floor nurse rushed into the room, alarmed by the sound of shattering glass and aggressive screaming. "Do not move, sir," the nurse commanded, pulling a pair of thick gloves from her pocket. "The glass is sharp." I ignored her warning. I quickly located the specific jagged curved shard of glass containing the thick white powdery residue. I quietly collected the broken piece and slipped it deep into my suit pocket for chemical testing. I left the intensive care unit with the jagged piece of glass burning a hole in my suit pocket. Valerie was still screaming aggressively at the nurses as the heavy door swung shut behind me. I walked down the sterile white hallway, keeping my head bowed like a defeated, broken old man. I navigated the labyrinth of the hospital corridors until I reached the desolate basement level where the pathology labs were located. Aaron was already waiting for me near the service elevator. I handed him the broken shard wrapped carefully in a clean linen handkerchief. Aaron held the thick glass under the harsh fluorescent light, examining the chalky white residue clinging to the heavy rim. I told him Madison brought that specific pitcher from the cafeteria right before my arrival to the room. Aaron immediately took the shard into a secure testing room while I stood guard by the heavy metal door. 10 minutes later, my son emerged with a grim, dark expression on his face. The rapid chemical analysis confirmed my absolute darkest suspicions. Aaron explained that the white powder was a highly concentrated dose of a powerful veterinary tranquilizer. It was not meant to kill me instantly. It was specifically formulated to render me entirely conscious but completely paralyzed and highly suggestible within 15 minutes of ingestion. The absolute malice of their plan crystallized perfectly in my mind. Madison and Valerie intended to drug me right there in the hospital room. Once the heavy sedative took effect and stripped away my physical autonomy, they would place the pen firmly in my hand. They would physically force my fingers to sign the fraudulent financial power of attorney and the forged will while I watched them helplessly. They wanted to look me directly in the eyes as they legally stole my entire commercial construction empire. I felt a cold, calculated fury settle deep into my bones. They thought I was a vulnerable, ignorant target they could easily manipulate with cheap parlor tricks and stolen chemicals. They had no idea they were actively trying to drug a man who had spent 40 years surviving the most brutal business environments in Chicago. Aaron crushed the handkerchief in his fist, stating that he would log the chemical evidence into his secure digital vault alongside the toxicology report. We were actively building an inescapable mountain of physical proof. I left the basement and walked out to the hospital parking garage to secure absolute privacy. Sitting in the quiet cab of my heavy work truck, I called Jonathan. The phone barely rang before my corporate attorney answered. Jonathan sounded incredibly tense, which was a rare occurrence for a man who dismantled hostile corporate takeovers for sport. He informed me that the covert forensic audit had uncovered a massive structural vulnerability in my personal portfolio. 3 months ago, Valerie had secretly taken out an illegal secondary mortgage on my primary residential estate. She used flawless master forgeries of my signature to bypass the standard banking security protocols. She secured a massive predatory loan from an aggressive private equity firm known for ruthless, swift collection tactics. Valerie and Madison immediately liquidated those funds into their failing luxury business ventures and hidden offshore gambling accounts. Because their businesses completely imploded, they missed every single repayment deadline. Jonathan explicitly explained that the private equity firm had officially triggered the strict default clauses early this morning. The bank intended to fully foreclose on the property and legally seize my entire estate by the strict end of the current week. Valerie did not just want to drain my liquid corporate assets. She had intentionally placed my actual home on the chopping block to fund her reckless arrogance. If I did not sign that power of attorney to release my corporate funds, they were going to let the bank throw me out into the street. They meticulously engineered a scenario where I would lose my home, whether I complied with their hostile demands or not. The sheer scale of their financial destruction was staggering. They had weaponized my own property against me while smiling in my face every single morning at the breakfast table. I stared out the truck window at the gray, overcast Chicago skyline. A weaker man would have panicked at the immediate prospect of losing a multi-million-dollar estate to a ruthless private equity firm. I did not panic. I spent my entire life turning massive piles of dirt into towering skyscrapers. I knew exactly how to manipulate a bad contract to my absolute advantage. I gave Jonathan his next set of strict explicit orders. I instructed my attorney to immediately contact the aggressive private equity firm holding the fraudulent mortgage. I told Jonathan to use one of my anonymous offshore holding companies to purchase the entire massive debt portfolio in pure cash today. I wanted to buy the exact loan Valerie had illegally taken out against my own home. Jonathan chuckled darkly on the other end of the line, realizing the brutal perfection of my financial strategy. By purchasing the predatory loan through a massive shell corporation, I effectively became the absolute owner of their fraudulent debt. I was now their primary and most unforgiving creditor. When the strict Friday foreclosure deadline arrived, Valerie and Madison would not be dealing with a faceless banking institution. They would be dealing directly with the anonymous holding company I controlled entirely. They thought they had trapped me under a mountain of lethal debt, but I had just purchased the very cage they locked me inside. I told Jonathan to finalize the aggressive acquisition within the hour and prepare the formal eviction notices for both Valerie and Madison. I hung up the phone, feeling the immense power of my unseen empire shifting into striking position. I stepped out of my truck and walked back into the bustling hospital lobby. I needed to maintain the careful illusion of the exhausted, compliant husband just a little longer. I navigated the crowded corridors, heading back toward the intensive care waiting area. As I turned the final corner, my sharp eyes caught sight of a familiar figure marching aggressively down the hall. It was Madison. She was not alone. Walking closely beside her was a tall, thin man wearing an expensive tailored suit and carrying a thick leather assessment clipboard. He wore a prominent hospital visitor badge, but he lacked the standard exhausted demeanor of the regular medical staff. He carried himself with the smug, arrogant confidence of a highly paid private consultant. I instantly recognized the tactical shift in her malicious strategy. Since the poisoned water pitcher failed to sedate me into compliance, Madison had quickly activated her backup plan. She had brought a corrupt private psychiatrist directly into the hospital. They intended to forcefully evaluate my mental capacity right there in the crowded public waiting room to legally strip me of my rights. I turned away from the crowded corridor and walked directly into the hospital cafeteria. I needed to control the environment for the impending ambush. I purchased a black coffee and sat at a small corner table facing the entrance. Less than 2 minutes later, Madison marched through the double doors. The tall, thin man in the expensive tailored suit followed closely behind her. He scanned the room with predatory eyes before locking on to me. Madison stormed over to my table and pulled out a chair uninvited. "Morgan, I brought someone to speak with you," Madison announced, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "The hospital staff contacted me and expressed severe concerns about your mental state. You have been wandering the halls, looking completely lost and agitated. This is Dr. Eris Thorne. He is a private specialist who evaluates cognitive decline in elderly trauma patients." I looked at Dr. Thorne. He did not carry the exhausted, compassionate aura of a genuine medical professional. He carried the slick, polished arrogance of a man who sold favorable legal diagnoses to the highest bidder. He set his thick leather assessment clipboard on the table and offered me a patronizing smile. "Mr. Carver," Dr. Thorne began, his tone incredibly slow and deliberately condescending, as if he were speaking to a small child. "Experiencing the sudden hospitalization of a spouse can trigger severe dementia symptoms in fragile individuals. Madison tells me you have been suffering from aggressive delusions and severe memory lapses regarding your own financial estate. Can you tell me what year it is? Can you tell me who the current president is?" I gripped my coffee cup, letting my hands tremble slightly to maintain the illusion of vulnerability. "I am just so incredibly tired," I muttered, keeping my eyes focused on the table. Dr. Thorne immediately leaned forward, sensing weakness. "Confusion and exhaustion are the primary indicators of cognitive failure," he stated smoothly, writing a quick note on his clipboard. "Madison informed me you recently became violent when discussing your business accounts. If you cannot remember basic facts or manage your aggressive outbursts, we will have to file an emergency conservatorship order today to place your daughter-in-law in full control of your life. Do you understand that you are completely unfit to care for yourself, Mr. Carver?" I stopped trembling entirely. I placed my coffee cup squarely on the table. I sat up straight, pulling my broad shoulders back and locking my eyes directly onto Dr. Thorne. The pathetic, broken old man vanished instantly. I let the cold, calculating weight of a commercial construction magnate settle over my entire posture. "It is Thursday, October 24th. I stated, my voice echoing with absolute concrete authority. The current inflation rate affecting domestic steel imports sits at 4.2%, resulting in a $3 million variance in my quarterly operational budget. My primary commercial estate is located at 4829 North Lakeshore Drive, a property I purchased on May 12, 1998, for exactly $2.4 million in pure cash. My routing number for my primary corporate holding account ends in 7382. Dr. Thorne froze. The patronizing smile slid completely off his face. His pen hovered uselessly over his clipboard. Madison shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her arrogant posture suddenly rigid with entirely unexpected panic. "Furthermore, Dr. Thorne," I continued, leaning across the small cafeteria table and dropping my voice to a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper. "Under the Illinois Probate Act of 1975, Article 11, Section A, any formal petition for a medical conservatorship requires the sworn affidavits of 2 independent state-licensed medical professionals who have conducted comprehensive multi-day neurological evaluations. You have spoken to me for exactly 90 seconds in a public cafeteria. Your diagnostic methodology is not just sloppy, it is entirely fraudulent." Dr. Thorne swallowed hard. The color drained completely from his slick, polished face. He glanced nervously at Madison, realizing he had walked into a massive trap. This was not a confused, helpless victim. I was reciting complex corporate financial figures and intricate state legal statutes with terrifying, flawless precision. "Mr. Carver, I am simply conducting a preliminary behavioral assessment," Dr. Thorne stammered defensively, trying to salvage his shattered authority. "You do not need to be hostile." "I am not being hostile," I replied smoothly, displaying a dark, merciless smile. "I am simply establishing the baseline facts for the permanent legal record. You were hired to fabricate a medical diagnosis to facilitate the theft of a multi-million-dollar commercial construction empire. You accepted a massive cash bribe to strip a perfectly healthy citizen of his fundamental human rights." I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out my smartphone and placed it gently on the cafeteria table directly next to his thick leather clipboard. The screen was illuminated, displaying a highly sensitive audio recording application. The bright red timer indicated that the software had been actively recording our conversation for the past 7 minutes. "You see, Dr. Thorne," I explained calmly, "I have spent the last 40 years dealing with corrupt city inspectors, hostile union bosses, and aggressive corporate saboteurs. I never enter a negotiation without an insurance policy. I just recorded you actively attempting to coerce a fraudulent dementia diagnosis to facilitate a massive financial crime." Dr. Thorne stared at the glowing red timer on the screen. Panic completely overwhelmed his features. "Filing a deliberately fraudulent medical assessment to the state court is a Class 2 felony," I stated, keeping my tone absolutely conversational. "It carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 3 to 7 years in a state penitentiary and the immediate permanent revocation of your medical license. My corporate attorney, Jonathan, is currently standing by. If you do not stand up, pick up your clipboard and walk out of this hospital right now, I will send this pristine audio file directly to the state medical board and the district attorney before you reach the parking garage." Dr. Thorne did not hesitate. He did not look at Madison. He grabbed his leather clipboard, shoved his chair back violently, and practically sprinted out of the hospital cafeteria. He abandoned his lucrative contract the exact second his own freedom was actively threatened. Madison sat completely alone at the table. Her grand legal strategy had just evaporated into thin air in under 10 minutes. She glared at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. Her chest heaved with heavy, erratic breaths as she realized I was entirely untouchable through the standard legal channels. I picked up my phone, saved the audio file to my encrypted server, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. "You have until Monday morning, Madison," I reminded her coldly. She stood up abruptly, her chair screeching aggressively against the cafeteria floor. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number, her hands shaking with absolute fury. She did not bother walking away to hide her conversation. "Listen to me," she snarled into the phone, explicitly barking orders to the underground document forger she had hired earlier. "The medical route is dead. I do not care what it takes. Finalize the fake property deeds and the new will right this second. We are taking the estate by force." I sat behind my massive mahogany desk at the downtown headquarters of my commercial construction firm. The panoramic glass windows overlooked the sprawling Chicago skyline, a magnificent city I had helped build with my own two hands. The heavy oak doors of my private office swung open, violently crashing against the wall. Heather marched right past my terrified executive assistant, completely ignoring the strict security protocols of the building. She slammed a thick black folder directly onto my pristine desk. I looked up, maintaining a completely blank, exhausted expression. She leaned heavily over the desk, her eyes burning with pure, ruthless desperation. "The medical conservatorship route failed yesterday," she stated coldly, "but I am definitely not walking away empty-handed, Waylon." She aggressively commanded me to open the black folder. I slowly flipped open the heavy cover. Inside the binder were dozens of highly detailed engineering reports and structural integrity assessments regarding my 3 newest residential high-rise projects. The documents explicitly stated that my company was intentionally using illegal substandard steel beams and severely compromised concrete mixtures to cut operational costs. The reports were absolute masterpieces of corporate forgery, containing fake signatures from prominent city inspectors and fabricated laboratory test results. Heather smiled a dark, predatory smile. She informed me that if I did not comply with her urgent financial demands, she would immediately leak these fabricated documents to the major Chicago newspapers and the Federal Building Commission. She gloated that the resulting massive media scandal and aggressive government audits would instantly paralyze all my active construction sites across the state. Prominent investors would pull their massive funding overnight. My pristine 40-year legacy would be completely eradicated in a matter of hours. The sheer audacity of her malicious pivot was almost impressive. When the corrupt psychiatrist failed to declare me mentally incompetent, she seamlessly transitioned into high-level corporate extortion. She was perfectly willing to destroy thousands of honest union jobs and completely obliterate my business just to secure her own greedy payout. I let the fraudulent engineering reports slip from my trembling fingers, scattering them haphazardly across my pristine desk. I intentionally allowed my broad shoulders to slump forward, physically adopting the pathetic posture of a completely defeated and broken old man. I looked at her with wide, terrified eyes, letting my voice shake with manufactured panic. "Heather, you cannot do this," I pleaded desperately. "These specific projects employ hundreds of hard-working families across the entire city. A sudden federal investigation would bankrupt the entire firm and destroy absolutely everything I spent my entire life building from the ground up." I begged her to reconsider the extortion, claiming the massive scandal would literally kill Sylvia if she woke up and saw the terrible news on the television. Heather laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed loudly off the glass walls of my office. She stated she did not care at all about my employees or my supposedly dying wife. She demanded exactly $5 million in untraceable corporate funds transferred directly into her private offshore holding account. She explicitly declared that $5 million was the exact non-negotiable price for her absolute silence and the immediate destruction of the forged engineering reports. If I refused her ultimatum, she promised to hit send on the emails to the press before she even reached the lobby elevator downstairs. I buried my face in my trembling hands, putting on the performance of a lifetime. I told her she had completely backed me into a corner, and I had absolutely no other choice but to comply with her brutal extortion. I agreed to surrender the massive funds. Heather smiled triumphantly, her arrogant ego completely blinding her to the massive trap I was actively laying beneath her feet. She instructed me to meet her at the hospital first thing tomorrow morning. She explicitly ordered me to bring my master corporate check first thing tomorrow morning. She explicitly ordered me to bring my master corporate checkbook and the final property transfer deeds directly to Sylvia Recovery Room. She promised to hand over the encrypted flash drive, containing the fabricated reports the exact second my signature hit the paper. I nodded weakly, confirming I would be there with the money. She turned and marched out of my office, radiating the smug, absolute confidence of a woman who believed she had just conquered a giant. The exact moment the heavy office doors clicked shut behind her, I sat up perfectly straight. The pathetic illusion of the terrified victim evaporated instantly from my posture. I reached for my desk phone and dialed Jonathan, my ruthless corporate attorney. He answered on the very first ring. I told him Heather had just escalated her reckless strategy to explicit corporate extortion using forged structural engineering reports. I instructed Jonathan to completely finalize the legal trap we had been meticulously preparing all week. I ordered him to prepare the immediate execution of Protocol 0 for tomorrow morning. Jonathan confirmed that my anonymous holding company had successfully purchased the massive predatory loan Sylvia illegally took out against my primary estate. We were now her absolute sole creditors, holding all the leverage. I told Jonathan to prepare the formal eviction notices and the immediate strict asset freeze protocols. Tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, every single dollar Heather and Sylvia relied on would completely vanish simultaneously. Their offshore gambling accounts, their failed luxury business lines, and their stolen credit cards would be permanently locked by federal fraud alerts. Any transaction they attempted would instantly decline. Jonathan promised the financial annihilation would be swift, absolute, and entirely untraceable until it was far too late for them to react. I hung up the phone, feeling the immense weight of my unseen empire shifting into its final striking position, ready to crush them. My personal cell phone vibrated aggressively on the desk. It was an urgent call from Brandon at the hospital. He informed me that the medical administration had suddenly upgraded Sylvia's status. She was recovering from the severe chemical trauma much faster than the toxicology experts anticipated. Brandon warned me that she was being aggressively transitioned out of the intensive care unit and moved into a standard private recovery room on the 4th floor. He had intercepted a frantic text message Heather sent to Sylvia outlining the final extortion plan. They were coordinating an absolute unescapable ambush. They intended to execute the final signing of the fraudulent property deeds and the $5 million corporate transfer together in her hospital recovery room tomorrow morning. The stage for the absolute final confrontation was officially set, and the predators were completely unaware they were the actual prey. I arrived at the hospital exactly at 9 o'clock the next morning. The sterile smell of the 4th floor recovery wing hung heavy in the air as I pushed open the heavy wooden door to room 412. I expected to see a weak, recovering patient resting in bed. Instead, Sylvia was fully dressed in a designer cashmere sweater and dark slacks, sitting perfectly upright in a hospital wheelchair near the window. The terrifying chemical seizures she suffered yesterday seemed to have left absolutely no physical toll on her. Her posture was rigid, and her dark eyes locked onto me with the cold, predatory calculation of a trap snapping shut. Heather stood directly beside the wheelchair, acting as her ruthless enforcer. Heather clutched a thick black leather binder tightly against her chest. Inside that binder were the forged property deeds, the fraudulent transfer documents, and the $5 million extortion agreement we discussed in my office. They had strategically positioned themselves with the bright morning sun behind them, attempting to cast long, intimidating shadows across the small hospital room. I stopped just inside the doorway, allowing my shoulders to slump forward heavily. I let out a long, trembling sigh, intentionally displaying the deep exhaustion of a man who had finally surrendered completely. Sylvia offered me a thin, chilling smile that did not reach her eyes. She did not ask how I was doing, and she certainly did not thank me for saving her life at the cafe. She simply pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the small rolling tray table positioned in the center of the room. I walked forward slowly, pulling my master corporate checkbook from my inner jacket pocket and placing it onto the plastic tray. Heather stepped forward with aggressive, arrogant confidence. She slammed the heavy leather binder down right next to my checkbook, flipping it open to reveal the stack of meticulously fabricated legal documents. The trap was perfectly laid out before me. They truly believed they had backed a multi-million-dollar commercial construction magnate into an inescapable corner. I looked at the two women who had conspired to destroy my life, poison my coffee, and extort my legacy. I kept my expression entirely blank, masking the immense satisfaction burning deep inside my chest. Heather reached into her designer bag and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. She stepped aggressively into my personal space and shoved the cold metal pen directly into my open palm. She tapped her long fingernail against the bottom of the extortion agreement, detailing the exact terms of my absolute surrender. You are going to sign every single page, Waylon, she commanded, her voice dripping with venomous authority. You are going to sign over the primary estate, the lake house, and immediately authorize the $5 million wire transfer to my private offshore account. If your hand hesitates for even a single second, I will hit send on my phone. The fabricated engineering reports will be sitting in the inbox of every major newspaper in Chicago before you can even walk out of this hospital. The Federal Building Commission will shut down your active commercial construction sites by noon. Your entire 40-year legacy will be completely obliterated. Sylvia leaned forward in her wheelchair, relishing the brutal psychological assault. Her dark eyes gleamed with pure malicious triumph. You really should have just signed the deed at the cafe yesterday, Waylon, she sneered cruelly. You brought this immense humiliation upon yourself. You are simply too old and far too weak to fight us anymore. You spent your entire life building a massive empire, but you completely failed to realize that we were the ones holding the keys to the kingdom. You are a relic of the past. It is time for you to step aside and fund the future you owe us. I stared down at the documents, feeling the cold silver pen resting in my hand. I looked at Sylvia, absorbing the absolute depth of her betrayal. You are truly willing to destroy thousands of innocent union jobs just to secure a payout, I asked, letting my voice shake pathetically. I built those high-rise projects to support hardworking families. Sylvia laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the sterile hospital walls. I do not care about your pathetic construction workers, she stated coldly. I only care about securing the luxury and comfort I am rightfully owed. Sign the papers right now, Waylon, and accept your defeat with whatever tiny shred of dignity you have left. I lowered my head, submitting to their ruthless demands. I pressed the silver pen against the thick parchment and signed my name on the bottom of the extortion agreement. I flipped to the forged property deeds and signed those as well. I deliberately made my signature look shaky and weak, perfectly matching the profile of a broken, defeated old man. I filled out the master corporate check for exactly $5 million and placed it on top of the stack. The exact second the pen lifted from the final page, Heather lunged forward. She aggressively snatched the heavy leather binder and the check off the rolling tray, clutching her ultimate prize tightly against her chest. She let out a loud, victorious laugh that bordered on completely manic. You really are a pathetic, gullible old fool, Waylon, she mocked viciously. I cannot believe how easily you just surrendered your entire life work. We completely outsmarted you at every single turn. You thought you were an untouchable titan of the Chicago construction industry, but you just handed over your entire legacy to a woman you actively despise. We secured your empire without breaking a single sweat. Sylvia clapped her hands together in the wheelchair, radiating arrogant satisfaction. We are leaving this miserable city tomorrow, she boasted loudly. We are taking your money and relocating to the coast. You will spend the rest of your miserable short life sitting alone in a cheap rented apartment, completely forgotten by the world. I stood perfectly still, allowing their cruel, mocking laughter to fill the small hospital room. I slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. The pathetic, trembling posture vanished instantly from my broad shoulders. I pulled out a single crisp white document embossed with the heavy gold seal of my corporate legal firm. I dropped the document squarely onto the plastic tray table right in front of them. You can keep those forged deeds and that check. Heather, I stated, my voice resonating with concrete authority. They are entirely worthless pieces of paper. My signature does not authorize anything anymore. Exactly 48 hours ago, my corporate attorney, Jonathan, legally transferred every single one of my physical properties, liquid bank accounts, and commercial business shares into a highly secure, irrevocable, blind trust. I do not legally own a single dime for you to steal. Heather snatched the crisp white document from the plastic hospital tray. Her eyes darted aggressively across the thick legal parchment, absorbing the dense corporate terminology. I watched her arrogant posture slowly collapse as the devastating reality of the legal paperwork set in. The heavy gold seal of Jonathan Corporate Law Firm sat perfectly at the bottom of the page, validating every single word. The document explicitly detailed the immediate transfer of my entire commercial construction empire, all personal real estate holdings, and every liquid financial account into a highly secure, irrevocable, blind trust. I explicitly explained to her that an irrevocable trust means the original owner entirely relinquishes all legal control over the assets. I am no longer the owner of my own wealth, I stated, my voice radiating pure concrete authority. A private board of independent corporate trustees now manages every single dime of my estate. That means the signature you just forced me to write on your fraudulent property deeds is entirely meaningless. I cannot legally transfer a multi-million-dollar lake house or my primary residential estate to you because I do not own them anymore. That $5 million check you are holding so tightly against your chest is drawn from an account that was officially closed and completely drained 48 hours ago. Heather stared at the check in her hand as if it had suddenly caught fire. The victorious smirk melted off her face, replaced by a mask of absolute terrified confusion. She looked down closely at the forged deeds and the extortion agreement, realizing she had spent months meticulously planning a grand heist to rob a vault that was completely empty. "You are lying," she stammered, her voice shaking violently. "You cannot just give away a commercial construction empire overnight. It takes months of corporate restructuring." I smiled a cold, merciless smile. "It takes months if you use standard family lawyers," I corrected her smoothly. "It takes exactly 12 hours when you utilize the single most ruthless corporate litigator in Chicago. I have spent my entire life building massive, unbreakable foundations, Heather. I secured my legacy the exact second you aggressively threatened it. The documents you are holding are completely useless pieces of paper. You extorted a brilliant man with absolutely nothing to his legal name. You have utterly failed. Your master plan is officially dead. The financial game is entirely over now." Sylvia slammed her hands violently against the armrests of her hospital wheelchair. Her face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of red, completely abandoning the fragile sick patient routine. She refused to accept the catastrophic defeat unfolding right in front of her. "Call the bank right now, Heather," Sylvia screamed, her voice echoing harshly off the sterile hospital walls. "Do not listen to this pathetic old fool. He is bluffing to buy himself time. Deposit the $5 million check digitally through your offshore wealth manager immediately. Force the transaction through before his lawyers can block the transfer." Heather fumbled frantically with her designer handbag. Her hands were shaking so severely she dropped the heavy silver fountain pen onto the linoleum floor. She pulled out her smartphone and immediately dialed the direct line to her private wealth manager. She placed the phone on speakerphone, resting it on the plastic tray table, so Sylvia could hear the transaction process. The phone rang 3 times before an automated voice answered. Heather keyed in her private account number and her secure biometric PIN code. Instead of routing her to a live representative, the automated banking system delivered a chilling mechanical message. "We are sorry, but all financial accounts associated with this Social Security number are currently frozen pending an active federal fraud investigation." Heather gasped loudly. She frantically punched the keypad again, dialing her secondary offshore gambling account. The exact same automated message played aloud, filling the quiet hospital room with the sound of total financial ruin. Protocol Zero had been executed flawlessly. Jonathan had not just locked down my commercial assets, he had completely obliterated theirs. Sylvia stared at the phone in absolute horror. "What does that mean?" Sylvia demanded, aggressively pulling at the collar of her cashmere sweater. "Why are your personal accounts completely frozen?" I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us. "It means you are completely destitute," I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerous razor-sharp whisper. "Every single dollar you stole from my Sun life insurance policy has vanished permanently. Your fraudulent credit cards are entirely locked. Your offshore accounts are red-flagged for international wire fraud. You have absolutely no money left to pay the corrupt document forger you hired earlier this morning. You have no money to pay this extremely expensive hospital bill today. You are entirely bankrupted and utterly defenseless against the incoming storm." Heather backed away from the hospital tray table, looking as though the sterile walls were actively closing in around her. The crushing realization of her absolute financial annihilation paralyzed her entirely. Sylvia, however, completely refused to surrender her arrogant entitlement. "You cannot do this to us," wailed Sylvia hissed venomously, her dark eyes burning with pure malicious hatred. "I am still your legal wife. I have marital rights to the primary residential estate. I will simply return to the house and legally refuse to leave the premises. You cannot throw me out into the street like common trash." I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket one final time. I pulled out a thick red legal folder and dropped it squarely onto her lap. "You do not have a home to return to, Sylvia," I declared with absolute unshakable finality. 3 months ago, you secretly took out a massive illegal secondary mortgage on my primary residential estate using a flawless forgery of my signature. You secured a highly predatory loan from a ruthless private equity firm to fund your reckless, luxurious lifestyle. You failed to make a single repayment, and the firm officially triggered the strict default clauses early yesterday morning. Sylvia stared down at the red folder, her breathing becoming incredibly erratic and shallow. My corporate attorney purchased that massive predatory debt through an anonymous offshore holding company, I explained, watching her entire fraudulent world collapse. I am now your primary and sole creditor, Sylvia. Because you defaulted on the fraudulent loan, I initiated immediate severe foreclosure proceedings this morning. You do not own the estate. You do not have marital rights to a formally foreclosed property. The legal documents resting on your lap are formal eviction notices. You are officially homeless. Sylvia let out a gut-wrenching shriek of pure, unfiltered rage. She completely abandoned any pretense of gentle medical recovery. She lunged forward aggressively, launching her entire body out of the hospital wheelchair, intending to physically attack me. Her hands curled into tight, violent claws, aiming directly for my face. Before her fingers could even graze my suit jacket, the heavy wooden hospital room door swung open with a massive, violent crash. Jonathan strode purposefully into the room, carrying his signature black leather briefcase. Standing directly behind my ruthless corporate attorney were two tall, heavily armed, uniformed Chicago police officers. The massive steel trap was officially closed forever, shutting them entirely in today. Jonathan walked straight past the frozen figures of my wife and daughter-in-law. His polished leather shoes clicked against the hospital floor with the steady, rhythmic certainty of a ticking clock. He stopped directly in front of the two heavily armed Chicago police officers who had flanked him through the doorway. He placed his signature black leather briefcase onto the small rolling tray table, pushing the worthless forged documents aside. The metallic snap of the briefcase lock's opening sounded like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet room. Jonathan reached inside and pulled out a massive, thickly bound legal file, handing it directly to the lead police officer. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of emotion. He spoke with the cold, mechanical precision of a corporate executioner. Inside that primary file, you will find the complete chronological documentation of a massive, ongoing financial conspiracy, Jonathan stated clearly. You have the 3 fraudulent maximum payout life insurance policies with my client listed as the insured. You will plainly see the perfectly forged signatures transferring the primary beneficiary status directly to a private holding company, controlled entirely by Heather. Jonathan pulled a secondary folder from his briefcase and handed it over. You also have the heavily fabricated medical conservatorship drafts. These documents include a completely fake psychiatric evaluation purchased with a massive cash bribe intended to illegally strip a healthy man of his fundamental human rights. Finally, you have the raw audio transcripts and the corresponding digital files. My client covertly recorded Heather standing inside his own living room, actively negotiating with a known underground document forger. The audio explicitly captures her offering a $50,000 cash advance to completely fabricate a new last will and testament. The lead officer took the heavy files, his eyes scanning the top pages with severe professional scrutiny. Sylvia sat completely paralyzed in her hospital wheelchair, staring at the overwhelming mountain of physical evidence Jonathan was casually handing to the authorities. The arrogant mastermind who thought she could seamlessly poison her husband and steal his construction empire was now watching her entire malicious operation get disassembled piece by piece in broad daylight. Heather backed away until her shoulders hit the cold hospital wall. She was breathing rapidly, her chest heaving, as the absolute reality of her catastrophic failure finally settled over her. She realized Jonathan had not just frozen her bank accounts. He had meticulously built an inescapable federal cage around her. The lead police officer closed the thick legal file and looked directly at Heather. He stepped forward, closing the physical distance between them. The heavy utility belt around his waist creaked slightly in the tense silence of the recovery room. We are fully aware of the audio recordings regarding your illicit negotiations, the officer stated, his voice projecting absolute unyielding authority. We know exactly who you brought to the estate yesterday afternoon. The contractor you hired to supposedly inspect the roof is a highly notorious convicted felon with a lengthy federal record for corporate fraud and identity theft. Heather shook her head aggressively, trying to deny the accusation, but her voice completely failed her. Her throat worked dryly, but no words came out. The officer did not give her a single second to recover her composure. He delivered the final devastating blow to her shattered defense. A tactical unit raided his underground printing facility exactly 3 hours ago. The officer continued, watching her face drain of all remaining color. He was arrested while actively attempting to replicate the state watermarks on your fraudulent property deeds. When the federal agents presented him with the covert audio recording, captured by Mr. Carver, he immediately realized he was facing decades in a state penitentiary. He did not hesitate to save himself. He completely folded under the intense pressure and formally accepted a comprehensive plea deal. As a direct condition of his immediate immunity, he handed our cybercrimes division his fully unencrypted hard drives. We currently possess every single text message you sent him over the past 3 months. We have the digital receipts for the initial wire transfers you used to secure his illicit services. We have the incredibly specific email chains where you explicitly instructed him to overwrite the multi-million-dollar commercial estate and bypass the standard probate courts entirely. You left a massive, undisputed digital footprint detailing your exact criminal intentions. Heather stared at the officer in pure, unfiltered horror. The contractor she trusted to secure her a stolen fortune had effortlessly thrown her to the wolves the exact second his own freedom was threatened. The grand elaborate heist she had spent months planning was completely exposed. There was no clever legal loophole or expensive defense attorney that could possibly save her from the overwhelming tidal wave of concrete evidence now resting securely in police custody. She was completely and utterly trapped. Heather looked wildly around the sterile hospital room, searching for any possible exit from the catastrophic nightmare she had created. Her panicked eyes finally locked onto Sylvia, sitting rigidly in the hospital wheelchair. The arrogant, unified front they had maintained for months shattered instantly under the crushing weight of impending prison sentences. Heather aggressively pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at her mother-in-law. "She forced me to do it," Heather shrieked, her voice echoing hysterically. "She orchestrated the entire financial conspiracy from the very beginning. I am just a grieving widow. She manipulated my trauma. Sylvia illegally mortgaged the primary residential estate 3 months ago using forged signatures. She blew the money on her own failed luxury businesses and demanded I find the document forger to cover her tracks. She threatened to cut me out of the family entirely if I refused to participate." Sylvia erupted from her wheelchair, her face contorted into a mask of pure malicious rage. "You parasitic, greedy little liar," Sylvia screamed, lunging forward despite her recent chemical trauma. "You blew the entire $2 million life insurance payout on luxury sports cars and offshore gambling accounts. You drained our capital completely dry. You were the one desperate for cash. You brought the fake structural engineering reports into his office to extort him for $5 million. I did not force you to do anything. You are a manipulative gold digger who tried to burn my husband down for a quick payout." They tore each other apart viciously, throwing every single shared secret and hidden crime directly into the open air. The fierce, unshakable alliance they built on shared greed completely dissolved into a pathetic, desperate scramble for self-preservation. They actively incriminated each other, validating every single piece of evidence Jonathan had just handed to the authorities. The lead police officer had heard enough of their vicious screaming match. He stepped forward firmly, separating the two furious women. He reached around to the back of his heavy utility belt and pulled out a pair of solid steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clinking sound immediately silenced their aggressive shouting. Before the officer could officially read them their rights and secure their wrists, the heavy wooden door of the hospital recovery room swung open slowly. The room fell completely silent as a tall man wearing a pristine white doctor coat stepped deliberately over the threshold. It was Brandon. The heavy wooden door of the hospital recovery room swung open slowly. The room fell completely silent as a tall man wearing a pristine white doctor coat stepped deliberately over the threshold. It was Brandon. Heather and Sylvia stared at him in absolute unfiltered horror. The vicious screaming match between the two women died instantly in their throats. Sylvia gripped the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly, her knuckles turned entirely white. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound emerged. She looked as though a literal ghost had just manifested under the harsh fluorescent lights of the trauma ward. Heather backed away until her spine hit the wall. Her oversized designer sunglasses slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the cold linoleum floor. She shook her head violently side to side, refusing to process the impossible reality standing right in front of her. Brandon stood perfectly still. He did not display a single ounce of anger or vindictiveness. He carried the cold, mechanical authority of a man who had waited nearly a decade for this exact moment. "Hello, Heather," Brandon stated, his deep voice resonating with concrete certainty. "Hello, Sylvia. It has been a very long time." Heather let out a pathetic whimpering gasp, pressing her hands flat against the wall behind her as if trying to push herself through the solid drywall. "You are dead," she stammered, her voice barely a raw, broken whisper. "I buried you. I stood at the cemetery and buried your ashes." Brandon took a slow, deliberate step into the center of the room. He positioned himself directly beside me, presenting an unbreakable, united front. You buried an empty wooden box filled with generic ash to satisfy the insurance adjusters, Heather, he corrected her smoothly. You stood at my funeral and squeezed out manufactured tears for the cameras while actively calculating the exact moment my life insurance policy would clear your private bank account. I did not burn in that catastrophic boat fire on Lake Michigan 9 years ago. I am standing right here completely alive and entirely aware of every single malicious crime you both committed to secure my trust fund. The sheer magnitude of his statement sucked the remaining oxygen out of the sterile hospital room. The flawless criminal empire they had built on his supposed grave was officially crumbling into dust. Heather slid slowly down the wall, unable to support her own weight. Sylvia remained paralyzed in her wheelchair, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Brandon looked down at the two terrified women and meticulously detailed the exact reality of his survival. You rigged the primary fuel lines on the boat engine block to deliberately flood the lower cabin with highly combustible fumes, Brandon explained his tone, analytical and entirely devoid of mercy. You intentionally jammed the secondary escape hatch so I would be trapped below deck when the ignition sparked. You meticulously planned to burn me alive in the middle of the lake to collect my $5 million trust fund. You simply underestimated my survival instincts. I smelled the massive raw fuel leak the second I turned the ignition key. I shattered the reinforced glass of the side portal and dove straight into the freezing waters of Lake Michigan exactly 3 seconds before the entire vessel detonated into a massive fireball. I swam to the shoreline in complete darkness, knowing that if I went to the police without concrete proof, you would simply hire expensive defense attorneys and try to murder my father next. Brandon turned to the two uniformed Chicago police officers standing silently near the doorway. He reached into the deep pocket of his white doctor coat and pulled out a heavy sealed manila envelope. He handed it directly to the lead officer. I spent the last 9 years building a completely new identity and attending medical school out of state. Brandon continued watching Heather, faced a drain of all remaining color. But I never stopped watching you. I utilized highly secure digital networks to monitor every single financial transaction you made with my blood money. I tracked your failed luxury businesses and your massive offshore gambling accounts. Inside that envelope is the suppressed forensic marine report from the original wreckage recovery. It contains definitive photographic evidence of the intentionally severed fuel lines and the physical tool marks left by the bolt cutters you used. You did not execute a flawless murder. You left a permanent mechanical trail of your absolute guilt. The police officer opened the envelope and reviewed the official marine forensic documents, confirming the explosive physical evidence. The entire foundation of their stolen wealth was irrevocably destroyed in broad daylight. Sylvia suddenly began hyperventilating. The monitors attached to her wheelchair beeped aggressively as her heart rate spiked into a terrifying erratic rhythm. She clawed at the collar of her expensive cashmere sweater, gasping frantically for air, as the crushing reality of a mandatory life sentence in a federal penitentiary finally settled over her. She could no longer manipulate or bribe her way out of this catastrophic snare. Heather completely abandoned her arrogant defensive posture. She collapsed onto her knees on the hard linoleum floor, crawling pathetically across the room toward Brandon. She reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of his pristine white doctor coat. "Brandon, please!" Heather sobbed hysterically, her face streaming with thick black mascara and genuine terrified tears. "You have to understand that I was heavily manipulated. I never wanted to hurt you. I mourned you every single day for the past 9 years. I never stopped loving you. Please, you have to forgive me. I am your wife. We can completely start over." Brandon looked down at the pathetic weeping woman groveling at his feet. His dark eyes reflected absolute unfiltered disgust. He took a deliberate step backward, refusing to let her toxic fingers touch his clothing. "You do not intentionally sabotage a boat engine and burn the man you love alive for a $2 million life insurance payout," Heather Brandon stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous razor-sharp whisper. "You do not funnel stolen blood money into offshore gambling syndicates while pretending to be a shattered, grieving widow. Your definition of love is nothing but pure parasitic greed. You are exactly where you belong right now, on your knees facing the absolute consequences of your own malicious actions." Heather buried her face in her hands, wailing loudly, as the final door to her freedom slammed permanently shut. Brandon turned his back on his former wife, completely disregarding her manufactured emotional breakdown. He looked directly at the lead police officer who was preparing to secure the handcuffs. The final trap was ready to be sprung. Brandon reached into his inner pocket one last time. He pulled out the official sealed toxicology report from Sylvia Emergency Admission yesterday afternoon. Hoon handed the damning medical document directly to the authorities, revealing the final, most terrifying secret they had desperately tried to bury. The lead police officer took the sealed medical document from Marquis. He opened the folder and scanned the highlighted laboratory results. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room seemed to dim as the sheer gravity of the paperwork settled over the authorities. Marquis stood tall, projecting the absolute authority of a chief medical professional. The toxicology screen definitively confirms the presence of aconite. In her bloodstream, Marquis explained, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. Aconite is also known as wolfsbane. It is an extremely potent, fast-acting cardiac poison. It causes violent seizures, respiratory failure, and immediate cardiac arrest. You do not accidentally ingest this specific toxin by eating bad food or mixing incompatible prescription medications. It is not commercially available at any pharmacy or hardware store. It requires deliberate, malicious extraction and highly specific preparation. The officer looked up from the paper, his eyes narrowing as he processed the terrifying implication. "Are you stating that this patient was actively poisoned?" the officer asked. Marquis shook his head, keeping his gaze locked entirely on Gwendolyn. "I am stating that she accidentally poisoned herself," Marcus corrected smoothly. "She collapsed at a public cafe earlier today while aggressively arguing with my father. She ingested the toxin through cross-contamination. She brought the substance to the meeting, intending to slip it into my father's beverage while he was distracted by the fraudulent property deeds. She made a sloppy, fatal error and managed to contaminate her own coffee cup instead. She literally drank the exact poison she spent weeks meticulously preparing for her husband." The sheer irony of her catastrophic failure hung heavily in the room. Gwendolyn stared at Marquis, her chest heaving violently. She opened her mouth to aggressively deny the accusation, to call him a liar and a fraud, but the police officer raised his hand, demanding absolute silence. "We need physical proof of this preparation," the officer stated strictly. "A positive toxicology report is highly suspicious, but it is not definitive proof of a premeditated murder attempt. We need the actual source of the toxin." I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between myself and the authorities. I had remained completely silent, watching my son dismantle their entire operation, but it was finally time to deliver the lethal blow. "I have the exact physical proof you need," I announced, my voice resonating with concrete certainty. Bradley immediately stepped up beside me, opening his black leather briefcase one final time. He pulled out a high-resolution digital tablet and handed it directly to the lead police officer. "I took these photographs inside my primary residential estate exactly 3 hours ago," I explained, keeping my posture absolutely rigid and commanding. "While my wife was lying unconscious in this hospital bed, I used a steel crowbar to force my way into her strictly locked private home office. I discovered a concealed biometric safe, hidden deliberately beneath the hardwood floorboards." The police officer swiped through the bright digital images on the screen. The high-definition photographs clearly displayed the shattered safe and its damning contents. Bradley pointed specifically to the final 3 images in the gallery. "You will see a small dark glass vial resting next to a highly precise digital scale and a sealed package of black latex surgical gloves." Bradley noted, his tone sharp and clinical. "That is the exact staging ground for the chemical extraction Marquis just described. Gwendolyn utilized her locked private office to meticulously measure and prepare the lethal dosage of aconite away from prying eyes. She left the physical murder weapon sitting right alongside the forged life insurance policies waiting to be deployed." The lead officer zoomed in on the dark glass vial, perfectly capturing the terrifying reality of the malicious conspiracy. He handed the digital tablet to his partner, who let out a low whistle of pure disbelief. "This completely changes the entire scope of our current investigation," the lead officer declared, his voice dropping an octave. "We arrived here to execute a standard arrest for massive corporate fraud and the intentional fabrication of legal property documents. Based on this new undeniable physical evidence, we are immediately upgrading the primary charges. Gwendolyn and Fiona are no longer just facing a white-collar financial trial. We are officially charging both of you with conspiracy to commit murder and the active premeditated attempted murder of William." The words struck the sterile hospital room with the devastating force of a massive lightning strike. The financial crimes would have guaranteed them a decade in a state penitentiary, but an attempted murder charge carried a mandatory permanent life sentence behind heavy iron bars. Their greed had officially cost them their entire existence. Gwendolyn suddenly realized she was completely and utterly trapped. She looked frantically at Fiona, hoping to deflect the blame entirely onto her younger accomplice. But the cold, hard facts completely crushed any potential defense strategy. She could not possibly blame Fiona for the lethal poison hidden securely inside her own private locked floor safe. She was the only person with the biometric access required to open that hidden vault. The absolute undeniable reality of her permanent downfall shattered her arrogant facade completely. Gwendolyn completely broke down. She began crying hysterically, fat, ugly tears streaming down her pale face, ruining her expensive makeup. She aggressively threw herself forward in the hospital wheelchair, reaching her trembling hands out toward me. "William, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate wail. "You have to stop them. You have to protect me. I am your wife. We spent 15 years together building a beautiful life. I was just scared and confused about the future. I never actually wanted to hurt you. You have to tell the police this is all a massive misunderstanding. Please, William, I am begging you. Do not let them lock me inside a dark prison cell for the rest of my life." I looked down at the weeping, broken woman begging for my mercy. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sorrow. I felt the profound, heavy peace of a man who had successfully excised a lethal tumor from his own body. I kept my hands firmly at my sides, refusing to offer her even a fraction of comfort. "True family does not forge life insurance policies and wait for you to die," I stated calmly, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing like a frozen blade. "True loyalty does not involve grinding up lethal toxins and smiling at me across the breakfast table. You made a conscious, deliberate choice to destroy my life for a quick payout. You viewed my generosity as weakness and my love as a temporary obstacle to your endless greed. You built this exact cage, Gwendolyn, and now you get to sit in it forever. I will not save you from the absolute consequences of your own malicious actions." I turned my back on her, completely dismissing her entire existence. The lead police officer stepped forward, the heavy steel handcuffs gleaming brightly under the harsh hospital lights, ready to drag them both into the dark abyss they entirely deserved. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped shut around Sylvia's wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed violently through the sterile hospital recovery room, finalizing the absolute end of her luxurious reign. The lead police officer recited the Miranda rights with a practiced mechanical rhythm. "You have the right to remain silent," he stated, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Sylvia did not fight the heavy restraints. Her arrogant defiance completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, broken shell. She stared blankly at the polished linoleum floor, her dark eyes completely empty of their usual predatory calculation. The overwhelming reality of a permanent life sentence in a federal penitentiary had finally shattered her mind. Heather, however, completely refused to accept her absolute defeat. When the second uniformed officer grabbed her arms to secure the solid steel cuffs behind her back, she thrashed wildly. She let out a desperate, guttural sob that tore painfully through her throat. "Waylon, please," she screamed aggressively, pulling against the officer's firm grip. "You cannot let them do this to me. I was just following her strict orders. I am practically your daughter." I looked at the pathetic, weeping woman who had spent 9 years actively spending the blood money secured from my son, supposed fiery death. "You ceased being any part of my family the exact moment you severed those brake lines," I replied, keeping my tone completely flat and unyielding. "You built your entire luxurious life on a massive foundation of gasoline and lies. Now you get to burn in the exact same fire you started." The officer jerked her arms back, securing the cuffs tightly, preventing any further resistance. "You have the right to an attorney." The officer continued reading the rest of the mandatory rights over her hysterical sobbing. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The sheer irony of the statement hung heavily in the crowded room. They had just lost every single dime of their stolen wealth to Jonathan's relentless asset freeze. They would be relying entirely on overworked public defenders to fight a vicious corporate attorney and an airtight homicide investigation. There would be no high-priced legal salvation for either of them. The absolute weight of justice had finally crashed down upon them, trapping them perfectly in the snare they had so meticulously designed for me. The lead officer grabbed Sylvia by her upper arm, pulling her forcefully up from the hospital wheelchair. Her weak legs trembled violently, forcing her to lean heavily against the officer just to remain standing. The expensive designer cashmere sweater she wore looked absurdly out of place alongside the heavy steel chains binding her wrists. The officers marched them firmly toward the heavy wooden door. I stood directly beside Brandon, watching the two women who had terrorized my family finally face the public consequence of their boundless greed. The hospital corridor was no longer a quiet, peaceful recovery wing. Word of the massive police presence and the dramatic confrontation had spread rapidly through the entire medical facility. As the officers pushed the door open and escorted Sylvia and Heather out into the hallway, a massive crowd of doctors, nurses, and recovering patients stood gathered tightly along the walls. The sheer public humiliation was absolute and entirely undeniable. Heather tried to lower her head, attempting to hide her tear-stained face behind her messy blonde hair. She sobbed loudly, her expensive designer shoes shuffling awkwardly against the sterile tiles. The seasoned nurses who had carefully tended to Sylvia just hours earlier stared at them with pure, unfiltered disgust. They had heard the aggressive screaming and knew these women had intentionally brought a lethal, untraceable poison into a sacred place of healing. Sylvia did not even try to hide her face. She walked slowly like a condemned prisoner marching toward the gallows. The wealthy elite socialite who obsessed over her pristine public image and demanded absolute perfection from every caterer was now being paraded through a public hospital in tight handcuffs. I followed closely behind the police escort, maintaining a powerful, commanding posture. I wanted every single person in that crowded hallway to see that I was not a broken victim. I was the man who survived their lethal ambush and brought them to justice. The bright fluorescent lights overhead highlighted the stark contrast between their utter defeat and my absolute vindication. The officers guided them onto the large service elevator to avoid the crowded main lobby, ensuring their immediate transport to the downtown precinct. The heavy metal doors of the elevator slid shut, severing my visual connection to my treacherous wife and my murderous daughter-in-law forever. They were officially erased from my life, leaving behind nothing but a dark cautionary tale of parasitic greed. I turned around and walked slowly back into the empty hospital room. Brandon followed me inside, gently closing the heavy wooden door to block out the lingering whispers of the medical staff. We were finally entirely alone. The heavy, oppressive silence of the immediate aftermath settled over the room, filling the space where the vicious shouting had just occurred. I looked at my son standing tall in his crisp white doctor coat. The small crescent-shaped scar above his eyebrow served as a permanent reminder of the childhood we shared before. The darkness consumed our family. I reached out and wrapped my arms around his broad shoulders, pulling him into a fierce, desperate embrace. Brandon hugged me back with equal intensity, burying his face against my tailored suit jacket. 9 long, agonizing years of suffocating grief, chill anger, and deeply hidden secrets finally began to dissipate completely. The heavy concrete block that had rested firmly on my chest since the day I buried that empty, charred casket crumbled into dust. I wept silently, allowing the immense relief to wash away the hardened facade I had meticulously maintained. We held on to each other, anchoring our souls in the undeniable reality that we had survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable. We had successfully dismantled the predators who tried to slaughter us for a paycheck. Eventually, I pulled back, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. Brandon offered me a genuine warm smile that mirrored the exact expression my father used to give me after a hard day on a commercial build site. "We did it, Dad," Brandon stated, his voice thick with raw emotion. "The nightmare is completely finished." I nodded, taking a deep breath of the sterile air. Brandon placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Are you ready to go home now, Dad?" he asked softly. The simple question hung in the quiet room, triggering a sudden, profound realization deep within my mind. I thought about the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate waiting for me across the city. I pictured the massive empty hallways, the cold marble floors, and the hidden safe beneath the office floorboards. That massive, luxurious structure was a monument to Sylvia deception and my own blind compliance. I looked directly into my son's eyes, making a decisive, absolute choice about my future. "That estate is not my home anymore," I declared firmly. "I am never stepping foot inside that poisoned house again. We are going to liquidate everything and build something entirely new." Brandon drove my heavy work truck away from the downtown precinct, leaving the chaotic aftermath of the hospital and the police station entirely behind us. The dark Chicago clouds finally began to part, allowing thin rays of sunlight to hit the wet pavement. We drove in absolute silence, navigating the familiar streets until we reached the towering wrought iron gates of my primary residential estate. The massive property looked exactly the same from the outside, but the underlying reality of the structure had fundamentally shifted. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and we stepped together into the grand marble foyer. The sprawling mansion was completely silent, devoid of Sylvia and her aggressive demands, and Heather and her arrogant clicking heels. We walked slowly through the expansive, highly decorated living rooms and the formal dining halls. The sheer scale of the luxury felt incredibly suffocating to me now. Every expensive piece of imported furniture, every crystal chandelier, and every piece of modern art hanging on the walls was a direct physical monument to Sylvia and her endless parasitic greed and my own blind, miserable compliance. I pulled my cell phone from my tailored suit jacket pocket and dialed Jonathan. My ruthless corporate attorney answered immediately, fully anticipating my next tactical move. Jonathan, I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the vast empty hallway. I want this entire residential estate explicitly listed on the commercial real estate market by tomorrow morning. I want you to completely liquidate the lake house, the luxury vehicles, and every single physical asset connected to Sylvia and her fabricated lifestyle. Sell it all to the highest available cash bidder and completely scrub her toxic financial footprint from my permanent record. I want the capital diverted directly into the blind trust. Jonathan agreed without a single moment of hesitation. He promised to have his most aggressive real estate brokers walking through the property, evaluating the square footage before noon tomorrow. I ended the call and looked at Brandon, who was staring up at the vaulted ceiling. I told my son I absolutely refused to spend another night sleeping under a roof paid for by my sweat but claimed by my desperate enemies. We were going to pack only the specific items that truly mattered and leave the rest of the hollow, meaningless luxury behind for the corporate auction block. Brandon followed me up the grand sweeping staircase, ignoring the master bedroom entirely and heading straight for my private locked study at the end of the hall. This was the one room in the entire massive estate where Sylvia never bothered to enter because it contained nothing of monetary value to her. I unlocked the heavy door and we stepped into the small wood-paneled room. The space was filled with the actual foundation of my life. My original drafting tables, my rolled-up architectural blueprints, and the worn, heavy steel tools my own father had passed down to me before I started my commercial construction empire. Brandon grabbed a series of heavy cardboard moving boxes from the utility closet, and we began the meticulous process of packing away my true legacy. As I carefully wrapped a set of vintage steel calipers, Brandon opened the bottom drawer of my heavy oak filing cabinet. He pulled out a thick, dusty, leather-bound photo album. He sat down on the edge of the leather armchair and slowly turned the heavy pages. The album contained hundreds of photographs from the decades before the tragic staged boat fire on Lake Michigan. There were pictures of Brandon as a young boy wearing a bright yellow plastic hard hat, standing proudly next to me on my very first major commercial build site in downtown Chicago. There were photographs of his high school graduation and the day he earned his acceptance letter to medical school. The crushing weight of the 9 missing years hung heavily in the quiet study. I sat down in the chair across from him, looking at the physical evidence of the life we had violently lost. I am so incredibly sorry that you had to endure those 9 years completely alone, Brandon. I said, my voice thick with long suppressed emotion. You had to abandon your entire identity to protect me from the shadows. Brandon looked up from the photo album, his dark eyes reflecting a profound, hard-won maturity. I was never truly alone, Dad, he replied, his tone steady and reassuring. I watched you build your empire every single day. I saw your strength. We are not going to focus on the time they stole from us. We are going to focus entirely on the empire we are about to rebuild together right now. We spent the next 2 hours carefully boxing up the physical memories, slowly bridging the massive, agonizing gap that had separated us for nearly a decade. Exactly 2 hours later, the heavy doorbell rang, echoing sharply through the empty foyer. I walked downstairs and opened the door to find Jonathan standing on the porch holding a brand new, highly secured leather binder. He stepped inside, surveying the sterile, quiet atmosphere of the massive estate with a deeply satisfied nod. He walked straight to the kitchen island and opened the binder, spreading the crisp white legal documents across the granite countertop. Waylon, the asset liquidation is already in motion, Jonathan confirmed, tapping a silver pen against the paperwork. The banks have formally initiated the seizure of Heather luxury vehicles, and Sylvia offshore accounts are permanently frozen by federal mandate. Now we need to formalize the internal structure of your irrevocable blind trust, as we discussed on the phone. I picked up the silver pen and looked directly at Brandon, who had followed me down the stairs, carrying the final box of my architectural blueprints. I am not just transferring my assets to protect them from greedy parasites, I stated, my voice projecting absolute, unyielding authority. I spent 40 years bleeding into the Chicago dirt to build a legacy meant specifically for my bloodline. I looked down at the legal documents and firmly signed my name on the primary authorization line. Jonathan, I instructed strictly. I am officially transferring exactly 50% of my entire commercial construction empire, the liquid holding accounts, and all future developmental voting rights directly to Brandon. I refuse to let my son hide in the shadows of a fake identity for another single second. He is the rightful co-owner of this enterprise. Brandon stared at the signed documents, his chest heaving with sudden overwhelming emotion. He stepped forward, looking at the massive transfer of generational wealth. I will accept the partnership, Dad, Brandon stated, his voice dropping to a fierce, determined register. I will stand right beside you in the sunlight. But I have one strict, absolute condition for taking control of this massive financial power. I looked at him, waiting for his terms. I want us to use a massive portion of our commercial resources and our corporate legal team to establish a brand new specialized division. Brandon declared, his eyes burning with intense purpose. I watched Sylvia and Heather destroy lives for 9 years. I want us to actively hunt down predatory family members and corrupt medical professionals who use financial abuse to trap the elderly. We are going to use our empire to become their absolute worst nightmare. 6 months passed since the heavy steel doors of the downtown precinct slammed shut behind my former wife and daughter-in-law. The sprawling multi-million-dollar residential estate that had served as the staging ground for my own attempted murder was now completely liquidated. Jonathan, aggressive real estate brokers, sold the massive property to an international tech executive within 3 weeks of the listing. I took every single dime from that highly profitable transaction and permanently redirected the capital to build something entirely new. Brandon and I officially established the Carver Vanguard Initiative. We did not rent a quiet, obscure office space. We purchased a towering, multi-level commercial building right in the heart of the Chicago financial district. We positioned our massive, brightly lit headquarters directly across the street from the most powerful corporate law firms in the state. Our explicit mission was brutally simple and completely uncompromising. We provided elite, high-level legal and financial support for vulnerable elderly individuals actively trapped in abusive conservatorships and predatory family trusts. I used the absolute vastness of my commercial construction wealth to assemble a private army of the most aggressive forensic accountants and ruthless corporate litigators in the city. We did not simply mediate family disputes. We actively hunted down the greedy, opportunistic relatives who attempted to weaponize the legal system against the fragile and the elderly. When a panicked grandfather called our emergency hotline reporting that his children were forcefully selling his home, we did not offer empty, sympathetic words. I personally dispatched Jonathan to their front door with a barrage of immediate strict asset freezes and federal audit threats. We completely turned the tables on the abusers. We stripped them of their legal leverage and locked their bank accounts before they could steal another dime. The immense capital generated from the sale of my toxic past was now actively destroying the exact same kind of malicious predators who had tried to bury me. My son and I transformed my profound personal trauma into a devastating, highly organized weapon of absolute justice. The dark, suffocating silence that had dominated my life for the past 9 years was permanently eradicated. We replaced the heavy sorrow with a symphony of rapid structural action and concrete results. Every time our legal team shattered a fraudulent conservatorship document, I felt the lingering ghosts of my own betrayal dissolve further into the dirt. I found an immense, profound peace in this aggressive daily crusade. For years, I had intentionally diminished my own presence, shrinking my broad shoulders and burying my sharp intellect to appease a woman who fundamentally despised me. I played the role of the exhausted, fragile old man to keep a manufactured peace inside a profoundly broken home. That pathetic, carefully maintained illusion was now entirely dead. I walked through the sleek glass corridors of our new foundation headquarters, radiating the absolute concrete authority of a commercial titan. My mind was razor-sharp, entirely unburdened by the toxic exhaustion of Sylvia's endless emotional manipulation. I utilized my 4 decades of brutal commercial construction experience to systematically dismantle the corrupt networks operating throughout Chicago. I knew exactly how to spot a fraudulent financial ledger or a forged architectural signature from a mile away. I turned that exact same critical eye toward the predatory private equity lenders who specifically targeted vulnerable senior citizens. When a notorious downtown lending firm attempted to illegally foreclose on a 75-year-old widow using a highly manipulated secondary mortgage, I did not file a simple standard complaint. I aggressively leveraged my own anonymous holding companies to forcefully buy out the massive debt portfolio of the predatory lender itself. I became their absolute primary creditor overnight. I marched directly into their lavish corporate boardroom flanked by Jonathan and completely dismantled their entire operation in under 20 minutes. I legally forced them to completely dissolve the widow fraudulent mortgage and subsequently drove the corrupt lending firm into total permanent bankruptcy. We actively hunted the corrupt private psychiatrists and slick medical consultants who sold fake dementia diagnoses to greedy families. Our deep pockets funded rigorous independent private investigations that exposed their lucrative illicit bribery networks. We handed the undeniable physical evidence directly to the state medical board and the district attorney, resulting in immediate license revocations and heavy federal prison sentences. The underground industry of elder financial abuse in Chicago began to completely collapse under the crushing, overwhelming weight of our relentless legal strikes. I was no longer a quiet, compliant victim, waiting for the inevitable end. I was a massive, unyielding force of nature, actively protecting the people who could not protect themselves. The heavy, suffocating shadows that once threatened to consume my entire legacy were now entirely banished by the blinding light of our absolute, unshakable justice. Brandon completely refused to abandon his grueling, demanding work inside the trauma ward. He expertly balanced his intense, chaotic shifts as a dedicated emergency room physician with his newly established role on our foundation primary executive board. My son had spent 9 agonizing years completely hiding his brilliant mind behind a fabricated identity, moving invisibly through the sterile hospital corridors to protect us both from a lethal threat. I was finally standing firmly in the bright sunlight, reclaiming his absolute rightful place in the world. He attended our high-level corporate board meetings, still wearing his dark blue scrubs, offering crucial medical insights that allowed our legal team to swiftly invalidate fake psychiatric evaluations. We operated our massive, newly formed empire with absolute crystalline transparency. The thick, suffocating walls of deception and forced isolation that Sylvia and Heather had meticulously built between us were permanently demolished. Brandon and I formed an unbreakable, fiercely loyal bond forged in the incredibly intense fires of our shared survival. We did not keep a single secret from each other. If a complex legal case presented a severe tactical risk, we sat together in my spacious office analyzing the structural vulnerabilities until we discovered a flawless, concrete solution. I finally had my son back, and I realized that the profound strength of our unified bloodline was infinitely more valuable than any towering skyscraper I had ever constructed. We were actively building a legacy of absolute, unyielding protection that would easily outlast us both. Late one Friday afternoon, I sat completely alone behind my heavy mahogany desk, reviewing the final liquidation reports for Heather remaining offshore assets. The foundation internal mail courier knocked softly on my thick glass door. He walked inside and placed a small, incredibly distinct piece of mail directly into the center of my desk. The courier immediately stepped out, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet office. I stared down at the crumpled, slightly stained envelope. It did not carry the standard sleek branding of our typical corporate partners or the heavy seal of a local courthouse. The upper left corner displayed the harsh, highly restricted official stamp of the Illinois State Women Maximum Security Penitentiary. I reached forward and slowly flipped the thin envelope over. The return address was handwritten in a shaky, desperate script I had not seen in exactly 6 months. It was a direct personal letter from Sylvia. I carefully slid a heavy brass letter opener beneath the flap of the cheap abrasive paper. The harsh envelope tore open, revealing 2 pages of lined prison stationery covered in a frantic, erratic script. Sylvia had always prided herself on her immaculate, elegant handwriting, but the words spilling across this page were sloppy and violently desperate. I leaned back in my heavy leather office chair and began to read the final pathetic manifesto of a completely broken predator. My dearest, Wayland's letter began utilizing a sickeningly sweet tone that immediately turned my stomach. I pray every single night that you will find it in your heart to read these words. I am living in an absolute nightmare. The conditions inside this maximum security facility are completely inhumane, and I am terrified every single second of the day. She did not offer a genuine apology for grinding up lethal cardiac poison or handing me a forged property deed. Instead, she seamlessly pivoted to her favorite defensive strategy. She played the ultimate helpless victim. She dedicated the entire second page to completely throwing Heather under the bus. Sylvia claimed that her daughter-in-law was the true mastermind behind the entire multi-million-dollar financial conspiracy. She insisted that Heather had aggressively manipulated her trauma, completely isolating her and forcing her to participate in the lethal plot against her will. I was so incredibly blind and heavily medicated, Sylvia wrote her lies, leaping off the cheap lined paper. Heather threatened to cut me off from everything if I did not cooperate with the document forger. I never wanted to hurt you, Waylon. You have to believe that I was just a pawn in her malicious game. I am begging you to remember the beautiful life we shared together. The grand finale of her extensive manipulative letter was not a plea for legal salvation, but a pathetic request for cash. She explicitly detailed the miserable quality of the prison cafeteria food and begged me to deposit a few $100s into her inmate commissary account so she could purchase basic human necessities. She was still trying to treat me like an open wallet, even from behind a wall of solid federal concrete. I placed the two-lined pages flat on the center of my mahogany desk. I sat perfectly still, waiting for the familiar hot surge of burning rage that usually accompanied any thoughts of my former wife. I expected my pulse to elevate. I expected the bitter taste of profound betrayal to flood my mouth just as it had in the emergency room exactly 6 months ago. I waited for the anger to consume me, but absolutely nothing happened. The heavy, suffocating emotions that had dominated my entire existence were entirely gone. I felt a profound, vast emptiness when I looked at her handwritten words. I did not feel hatred or sorrow, or even a lingering sense of pity. I felt pure, absolute indifference. The woman who wrote this desperate, manipulative letter was a complete stranger to me. She was a ghost shouting from the bottom of an incredibly deep well, and her voice simply could not reach the surface anymore. I picked up the lined pages and ran my thumb over the cheap, abrasive paper. For 15 years, I had carefully tailored my entire life to accommodate her endless, luxurious demands. I had shrunk my own massive presence to avoid triggering her sharp, venomous temper. I had financed a complete illusion, believing that my silent compliance equated to genuine family loyalty. That pathetic, fragile version of Waylon Carver was permanently dead. I stood up from my executive chair and walked slowly across the spacious office toward the heavy industrial paper shredder resting in the corner. I did not hesitate for a single second. I fed the first page directly into the grinding steel blades. The loud mechanical whirring sound filled the quiet room as the machine aggressively chewed her pathetic apologies into tiny, meaningless strips of confetti. I fed the second page into the slot, watching her desperate demands for commissary cash dissolve into absolute nothingness. I dropped the torn envelope into the trash can, completing the total erasure of her toxic influence. She possessed absolutely no power over me or my empire ever again. I was completely unburdened and entirely free to command the massive legacy I had bled to build. The heavy glass door of my office swung open right as the shredder powered down. Jonathan stepped into the room carrying a sleek silver tablet and his trademark expression of absolute ruthless satisfaction. Our corporate legal team just received the finalized trial schedules from the district attorney, Jonathan announced, taking a seat directly across from my desk. The internal alliance between your former wife and your daughter-in-law has completely and permanently disintegrated. Jonathan tapped the digital screen, pulling up the official court dockets. Heather officially folded under the immense, crushing weight of the federal evidence. She realized that going to trial against our unassailable audio recordings and the digital footprint from the convicted document forger would result in an immediate life sentence. Her public defender aggressively pushed her to accept a comprehensive plea deal early this morning. She formally pled guilty to massive corporate fraud, identity theft, and active conspiracy to commit murder. She accepted a mandatory 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. She completely surrendered everything to save herself from dying behind bars. I nodded, slowly processing the absolute finality of her defeat. "And what about Sylvia?" I asked, keeping my tone completely clinical. Jonathan displayed a cold, merciless smile. "Sylvia flatly refused the plea deal because she completely refuses to accept responsibility for the poison found inside her own locked floor safe," Jonathan explained. "She is officially heading to a highly publicized criminal trial next month. The prosecutor possesses the verified toxicology reports, the macro photographs you captured, and Heather's sworn testimony explicitly detailing the entire premeditated assassination plot. Sylvia is staring down the barrel of a permanent life sentence, and she has absolutely no expensive defense attorneys left to save her. Their defeat is absolute and irreversible." I thanked Jonathan for his relentless execution of the legal trap. We had successfully eradicated the predators from our bloodline. I grabbed my tailored suit jacket from the back of my chair and checked my heavy gold wristwatch. I did not have time to dwell on their miserable incarcerations. I walked out of the towering corporate headquarters and drove my truck directly to the newly constructed community center funded entirely by the Carver Vanguard Initiative. I stepped through the backstage doors, listening to the loud, enthusiastic murmur of the massive crowd gathering in the main auditorium. I straightened my tie and prepared to walk out onto the brightly lit stage to deliver a powerful speech about absolute truth, undeniable resilience, and the fierce, unyielding protection of family. I stood firmly behind the heavy wooden podium, gripping the polished edges with my calloused hands. The grand auditorium of the newly constructed community center was completely packed. Every single seat was filled with individuals our foundation had successfully rescued from the devastating grip of financial abuse. I looked out across the massive crowd, feeling an immense, profound sense of absolute vindication. In the very front row sat Aaron. He was no longer wearing his blue hospital scrubs or hiding behind a carefully fabricated identity. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit and a bright, genuine smile that reached entirely to his eyes. Seeing my son sitting there completely alive and entirely free filled my chest with an overwhelming, undeniable warmth. I adjusted the microphone and allowed my deep voice to project clearly across the quiet room. We are gathered here today not simply to celebrate the opening of a building I began. We are here to celebrate the undeniable power of survival against those who wish to exploit us. For years, many of us were told that unconditional compliance was the only definition of family loyalty. We were heavily manipulated into believing that demanding respect was a selfish act of defiance. I looked directly into the crowd, making firm eye contact with the survivors who had fought their own brutal battles in the dark. True loyalty does not demand your absolute destruction, I stated firmly, my voice echoing off the high acoustic ceilings. Genuine love does not slowly drain your bank accounts or meticulously plot against your existence while smiling across a morning breakfast table. We must refuse to be the silent victims of proximity. We must actively stop allowing people to weaponize our love to fund their relentless parasitic greed. The audience erupted into a massive wave of thunderous applause. I watched Aaron clap his hands proudly, his eyes shining with absolute admiration. I had spent 40 years building massive skyscrapers across the Chicago skyline, but this specific room filled with empowered survivors was undoubtedly the most important structure I had ever built. The foundation of this community center was not poured with standard concrete. It was forged entirely from the shattered remnants of a toxic past and reinforced with the unyielding pursuit of absolute permanent justice. As the applause slowly died down, I took a deep breath and allowed myself to reflect on the brutal, agonizing journey that had brought us to this exact moment. I stood before them as a living testament to profound endurance. I spoke openly to the audience about the suffocating 9 years I spent grieving a completely empty, charred casket. I described the immense, crushing pain of believing my only child had died a terrifying, violent death while I unknowingly financed the extravagant, luxurious lifestyles of his absolute murderers. I did not hide the sheer terror I experienced in that hospital supply closet when the devastating reality of my wife and daughter-in-law malicious betrayal was finally exposed by my resurrected son. I wanted the crowd to understand that feeling. Overwhelming fear is a completely natural response to monstrous deception. But I also wanted them to fully understand that fear must never dictate your final actions. I explained the immense, profound strength required to execute absolute justice in total silence. I detailed how incredibly difficult it was to return to my massive, empty estate and play the role of the defeated, oblivious husband, while actively laying the intricate legal traps that would eventually obliterate my enemies. You must never allow anyone to mistake your inherent kindness for fundamental weakness, I declared, leaning closer to the microphone to emphasize every single syllable. A generous heart does not mean you possess a fragile, gullible mind. When predators attempt to back you into a dark corner, you do not simply surrender your hard-earned legacy to buy a temporary artificial peace. You meticulously study their arrogant movements, you secure your absolute leverage, and you strike back with such overwhelming permanent force that they can never threaten you or your true family again. The room fell into a heavy, deeply respectful silence. My words resonated deeply with every single person who had ever been financially manipulated by someone they implicitly trusted. I looked at my own hands, remembering the sharp, jagged piece of broken glass I had slipped into my suit pocket in the intensive care unit. That small piece of poisoned glass had been the absolute catalyst for my total liberation. I had completely transformed my darkest moment of vulnerable exposure into an unassailable fortress of corporate and legal retaliation, effectively neutralizing the threat forever. The grand opening event formally concluded to a thunderous standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls of the building. The attendees lingered in the massive auditorium, sharing their own profound stories of survival and legally reclaiming their stolen dignity. I stepped down from the elevated stage and was immediately met by Aaron. He wrapped his arms around me in a firm, solid embrace that spoke volumes without requiring a single spoken word. We did not need to discuss the heavy burdens of the past anymore. The fraudulent conservatorship papers, the lethal glass vials, and the relentless toxic manipulation were permanently locked away inside cold federal evidence boxes where they belonged. We walked together through the sleek modern glass doors of the community center and stepped directly out into the bright, crisp Chicago afternoon. The sprawling city skyline towered magnificently above us, reflecting the brilliant golden sunlight off the massive steel and glass structures I had helped design. The suffocating, dense fog of deception that had clouded my entire existence for nearly a decade was entirely erased from my life. The absolute truth reigned supreme over our newly reclaimed empire. Valerie and Madison were currently sitting in stark concrete cells, facing the brutal, permanent consequences of their boundless parasitic greed. Their names would eventually fade into total obscurity, serving only as a minor cautionary footnote in the vast history of my corporate legacy. I took a deep, clean breath of the fresh city air, feeling an incredibly profound sense of absolute peace settle deep into my bones. I was no longer a wealthy, oblivious target, waiting blindly in the shadows for a vicious predator to strike. I was an unyielding survivor who had successfully navigated the most treacherous emotional battlefield imaginable. I was the fierce, ruthless protector of my own massive commercial legacy. But most importantly, as I walked down the bustling city sidewalk, shoulder to shoulder with the brilliant doctor who had saved my life, I realized my greatest victory was not financial or legal. I was finally just a proud, incredibly grateful father who had managed to get his only son back from the dead. We walked forward together into the vibrant, bustling city, entirely ready to conquer absolutely whatever the future held for us. The silent adjustment was complete, and the unbreakable foundation of our family was finally set in stone. If there is one thing this harrowing ordeal taught me, it is that blind trust is a dangerous luxury. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, and marriage vows do not erase human greed. You must always protect your legacy with the same fierce determination you used to build it. Do not ever let your kindness become your greatest vulnerability. Stand your ground and never allow anyone to convince you that you are obsolete. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.